like to call the meeting to order. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday and a happy new year, and welcome back, and let's get to work. John Paul, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, I will. Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Jacobson. Ms. Williams.
Here.
Mrs. Wilson-Taylor.
Present.
Mr. Weed. Present. Ms. Wattenberg.
Present.
Mr. Batchel. Present. Ms. Woodruff.
Here.
Ms. Carter.
Present.
Madam Vice President, you have a quorum.
First item on the agenda is the physical education standards. Is that us? Yes.
Get started? All right, thanks so much for having me. I am Donna Anthony. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Health and Wellness over at OSSI, and thank you so much for having me tonight. I wanted to come and talk to you a little bit about the proposed physical education standards that we would like to discuss with you over the next several months. For many of you, we went through the health education standards process last year, and so we'd like to model some of that this year, and we'll just kind of review some of those timelines and procedures. All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's going on nationally and how we got to where we are locally, talk about our proposed timeline and process for the standards that we're putting before you all, and just talk a little bit about how the current local standards align to the national standards and how that's where we'd like to be towards, and then we can talk about any questions you might have. So this is a lot of history, but essentially just wanted to put before you that the conversation nationally really started in 1992, and they had some really big goals in terms of defining what a physically educated student would look like, and figuring out how academically that student would get there. In 1992, they were really only able to meet one of the two goals, and so they had to reconvene that work in 1995. In 2004, they met again and really started to clean up and consolidate a lot of that work from 7 strands down to 6 strands, and focus less on fine and gross motor development and more about competencies and understanding around physical education and the benefit of it in our life, so that it doesn't end when you leave school. So you'll see that in 2007, we always kind of like to be first on a lot of things in the country, and so right before the national standards came out, we came out with local standards, and so a lot of that work was happening in parallel. There was a local level discussion happening while there was the national one, but we didn't want to wait, and so we put something forward in place, which was pretty aligned to what ultimately came out nationally, but there are some differences, and so there is a need for us to think about it and update it a bit. So then again, in 2008, the national standards came out. Some additional tools and supports came out in 2013 with the grade level outcomes. And then just last year, we put forth new health education standards and felt like it was a great time now that we've accomplished that to move forward with physical education. And then ideally next year, our goal would be to tackle the adaptive physical education for our students with disabilities. Does anyone have questions on timeline? So I can make sure that this deck is available afterwards. This is a hyperlink to the national standards, the grade level outcomes, and then there's also the scope and sequence. We have reviewed these with a working group, and I can talk a little bit about our process, but feel like these are the best way for the district to move in, and would like to put them forward to you all over the coming months for consideration. The reason being is that there's been a lot of work nationally done around this. There's a lot of buy-in locally and nationally behind them. We feel like they are up to date and flexible enough to be adopted and implemented at the district level. And a lot of teachers are trained on these, and the curriculum is also developed. A lot of the curriculum that you can adapt is developed towards these national standards, and so it just kind of makes it really easy for folks. Also, if you remember with the health education standard, we did look at the national framework and tried to make that alignment, and so this kind of tees up well with our work last year in creating that national alignment. A lot of other states are using this wholesale or a slightly adapted model, and I put a few of those states right there for you. So September through December, we convened a monthly working group. We have the Health Youth in Schools Commission, who advises us on a lot of things related to the Healthy Schools Act. The Healthy Schools Act covers everything from school pardons to protected time for recess to nutrition standards for meals served in schools. And we have some subcommittees. There is a subcommittee related to physical education and physical activity that's been very engaged in this conversation. We have an expert who worked at the Centers for Disease Control and prevention around this work for 35 years. He's now a GW professor, and he chairs our subcommittee, and he's been helping us lead this conversation, and so it's great to have a national expert involved in the local efforts. We've also had several LEAs at the table. We've had the Public Charter School Board and members from DCPS at the table, as well as several community providers who do physical education and physical activity programs in our schools and have really good insight and feedback from what's happening on the ground currently and where we need to go. So I'm here today to talk about our desire to move forward with adopting the national standards. What we'd like to do is use the standards as kind of the starting place for really getting some good traction around physical education and activity in the district. We know that there's a lot of work to do similar to health education and health outcomes in the district. There's a lot of work to do in the physical education and physical activity realm. And the standards are kind of building that foundation for us. And so this is kind of one of the first places where we want to make a big impact and change. We'd like to bring an expert panel in front of you next month. And so that would be the person who chairs our subcommittee, who is the GW professor, a member from the national association called SHAPE, who developed the national standards, but also has a presence locally, and they have chapters all over the country, and they represent physical education teachers. And then ask for a vote in March, similar to last year, so that LEAs have time to plan to ensure that they're ready to implement for the next school year. So this is a super busy slide. I want to go out with a bang, tried to make it short and sweet, but wanted to put a lot in front of you right at the end. But this is a crosswalk for you just to get an idea of kind of where we are and where we want to go. So the second column shows the current strands for the DC standards, and we've highlighted and underlined the words that we feel like are comparable to what's going on, the language in the national standards. And as you can see, strand 1, standard 1 are pretty comparable. Same with strand 2 and standard 2. Strand 3 and 4 kind of mold up into standard 3. But what I really, really like and wanted to point out is standard 4 on the national standards. It's about the physically literate individual exhibits responsible personal and social behavior that respects self and others. And I think that has a great alignment to what we did around the health education standards. So it's not just knowing what you need to know and being able to perform the skills that you need to, but it's, it involves a level of self-respect and a respect for others, and really kind of absorbing what you're learning and using it effectively throughout your life. And so it builds that capacity and gives us kind of a framework to do that work, and also to kind of really marry the work of the physical education and health education. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions? We would like to send a follow-up document out that shows all of the current standards. The national standards, we have very few, about half a dozen minor tweaks that we would like to make. What we say is, if they say do an activity out in a field, we know that not all of our LEAs have access to a field, right? So we've removed some of those examples and are going to allow LEAs to figure out how they want to get that done, and we can provide technical support, whether it's connecting them to a DPR facility or field space or anything like that, but kind of not forcing it through the mandated standards. We also took out references to things like WeFit, because they quickly leave the standards in a couple of years. No one's going to know what WeFit is anymore. Kind of like when I say spaghetti to my kids, they have no idea. I think that is a good thing. So, any questions?
Thanks for your presentation. I'm curious from your perspective, if I look at the crosswalk and I say, okay, I see different words and I see they're oriented and worded in a more competency-based framework, in some cases, I'm not sure it really changes behavior of the teachers, or I'm curious about what you think will actually change.
So, same as health education, this is not the magic bullet. This is just creating the foundation to have a different mindset and a different framework in which to have those conversations. And so, having the right words on paper reinforces the right behavior in the classroom. And so, having that national alignment, I think, is really, really important for us as a starting place. I think what really is going to change is giving teachers, especially around the health and wellness work in particular, giving teachers the resources they need to do this. I mean, we can put really robust and progressive standards out there, but unless they have the tools and any sort of support to ask questions or to troubleshoot or to develop lesson plans, it's really hard to implement. And so that's where we see our role is in incentivizing good behavior by
And so as we're thinking about what we prioritize too, I'm wondering if I would love to hear more, maybe it can be next time or with the panel, what would meaningfully change that should make this elevate in the priority level. So for example, from certain segments of the population in Ward 1, I repeatedly hear about the lack of physical activity that's provided in our schools. And really it's about time and space, and that's the first recess, even if that's unstructured, it's still physical activity, is the first thing that a teacher will cut as a punitive measure for a student, right? So, but that's not necessarily aligned to a standard, I don't think, or is it? And is that gonna be some of the teeth that you use to ensure that there is actual adequate physical recreational time for students?
I mean, I think the resources is always a good question around the health and wellness work. Enough resources to buy a PE teacher, to have the right curriculum in place, to have the protected time to do it. I think we absolutely should be leveraging before and after school time to make sure kids are physically active. And I don't think we're doing that enough. And I think that our office can play such a role in that. That's not physical education, that is physical activity, but that's so important for kids. And I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there for and role for us to play. I don't think that this is gonna change that, but this is a starting place for us. I think making grants available and really creating a robust technical assistance model for us is important. And so we do an annual school health profile, which is an annual survey that all of our schools are mandated to complete. And what we're doing is creating kind of a tiered system on if you're really struggling in these areas, we're gonna get this much technical support from us versus the people who are really excelling. They're not gonna be getting technical support, but they will likely be getting visits from us so that we can learn from them and share out across the district with the people who are struggling and potentially matching them up. We're doing that now informally, and what I'd like to do is create a more robust and calculated model around how we do that.
Can you share that framework with us and we'll see more about it?
If I can just indulge in two more quick questions. I'm wondering, and when I look at your timeline, first of all, I don't think I fully understand the difference between 2017 and 2018, so I apologize if I missed that when you talked about it, what the proposed PE standards are introduced to us, and then proposed adaptive PE standards introduced to us. And are you thinking about, or do you believe community engagement and the change in standards is important?
So let me answer the first question. The first question, adaptive PE is for students with disabilities who do not access the general PE curriculum. And so typically it's a thing that's written into an IEP and is mandated as something that we need to have. And so that's something that we want to tackle next. That's going to require a lot more thought. There are national adaptive PE standards, but there's just more people that care about that and more work to do, so that's going to take more time. And so we wanted to do the general PE standards first and then the adaptive ones next year. So how general PE, adaptive PE. Community input, we did have this working group and have been consulting with people. I will say there's a pretty general consensus. We have not heard any concerns. The minor tweaks were ones that we got from the working group. Those are from these research experts from GW to the LEAs to providers in the field who are doing a lot of the before and after school programming, consulting on PE in the schools, and just really don't have any concerns that people are bringing to the table. So we feel like we have a pretty robust process coming to the table tonight already. It's a little bit different with the timing of last year, where we felt like we kind of had to take that off and do a whole different layer of community engagement around the culture. So I think people are ready for the refresh, and I think people are largely behind the national standards. They haven't really had much concern. I think there is a time and a need for support for the teachers to make sure that they have time to plan and prepare, but it's probably refreshing and easier going back to what they know and what they've been trained on.
Two things. First, when you say that people are very much behind these and behind the refresh, can you give us just in a paragraph what are the main differences substantively between these and what they're replacing? Or are they mainly the same? Is that what you're saying?
So the large strands that I had put up, the kind of large strands and standards are largely the same, but all of the actual minor standards within that are different. A lot of them were about gross and fine motor skills, like being able to do this and that, and now it's more about having a knowledge base and understanding it and understanding approach and understanding, creating lifelong habits as opposed to now I know how to kick a ball across the room. Now I understand like how my body works together to make that happen. Now I know what I need to do to be able to excel to the next level.
So one, I'm very interested in looking at these. I hope that insofar as you're describing them that way, it's not like a move from doing the stuff and getting the skills to something that's more academic, because I do think people really do want PE in their schools, so.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, I mean, it has both of those in there. And, we can share, there's, the national standards are hyperlinked. I have copies with me tonight. But it has all of that in there.
Just really quickly, I'm just trying to navigate the crosswalk. So, do our current standards not meet the national standard for at this point, or?
Right.
Okay.
There's not an explicit one that meets that national standard for.
Right.
I feel like that's really important.
And this process is gonna work that in.
And just to answer Ruth's question, I think the social behavior aspect is very important to be included in these, which is not included, just like Marcus said, in the old standard.
And then my second question is sort of following up on Laura's point about the importance of helping schools protect this time. And that's an issue that we hear all across the city. We heard in our ESSA meetings about protecting the time for all the non-tested subjects, right? So it's also history, social studies, science, the arts, and so on. With this, there's actually a law, right? There's a DC law that requires PE that, and there's been a Washington Post investigation suggesting that is widely not followed. And I just wonder, how do you interact with that? What's your thinking on that? How does this move the ball on that?
I think, St. Fisher. I think this is about creating the bar on what people need to know, right? And that's about creating protected time.
And do. I just want to make sure it's what they should know and what they can do.
Right,
Okay.
absolutely. So an example is runs for distance using a mature pattern, right? So it's not just knowing how to run, but it's actually running. So there are things in here, and that's why it's important to have the adaptive PE, because if you can't run, you need to be able to do something else to demonstrate that you understand what that would look like. And so, this is a piece of that, but I think, there's a lot of that other technical support on how to make sure you can fit PE in, how you can afford a PE teacher, and how there is an academic benefit for kids being able to have that physical activity in particular, but in addition to physical education. I mean, I do keep going back of we should be leveraging before and after school time. Like, I just feel like it's this missed opportunity. I see it with my own kids, and I think that that's something where we need a lot more movement. I also think, we looked at the national gold standard and set that as the bar in the district. And so, and it's a non-punitive law, and so what we've said is, we want you to do something that's really, really hard to do. With all the other things that are going on, there's the achievement gap happening, and we're gonna, double down on a lot of work related to that. We're gonna adopt Common Core and, Park, and also say you need to be meeting the gold standard that really no one in the country is able to figure out. I think what we like to do is set that as the goal, and figure out what the, what the base is. Is there a base? Is there an opportunity for a base? And how can we help people move from one to the other? I think it's really challenging, and I think a lot of people are grappling with it, and I think everyone is well intended and trying to figure out how to make it work. More and more, I think schools understand, parents understand, we understand the value of having a well-rounded child, and how this can provide that opportunity, but this is only a piece of it.
I'm sorry if this was discussed before I got here. I really hate being late, so thank you so much for being here. And if you've covered this, could you just tell me one more time?
Yeah.
How are we adapting these national standards to fit the needs of DC students? Like, how are we refining the national standards and modifying them, probably just slightly, to reflect the needs of our population?
So it's good question. We're proposing like 99% same as national.
Okay.
We feel like they were thoughtful enough. They knew that they were making them at the national level, that they had to be able to we're proposing about half a dozen minor changes, and so what we can do is create that walk and show you where those changes are proposed. An example that I provided was it references refit, for example, and that's going to outdate the standards in a few years, if not already. Another thing was, using field space. Well, not all schools in DC have field space, and so removing that.
If you can transmit that document to us, that would be really helpful. And then, additionally, I just want to make sure when you're ever in an association or a national standard, you usually off of a least common denominator, and I want to make sure that that we do this right and that we really reflect the needs of our students and district laws.
Absolutely.
Marcus?
Yeah, just a quick question. Has there been a point even with the implementation of our current standards where administrators or teachers have expressed that they've had difficulty meeting these standards because of resources and not necessarily just the money to hire a physical education teacher, but maybe it's facilities or equipment? Has that been a large problem, I think, kind of across the board?
Absolutely. And that's why we tried to create that flexibility in not mandating that you have a field, but there's still a lot of creative ways that you can meet that standard. And I feel like the onus is on us in coming out to your school and helping you figure out how to do it, and helping you make that relationship with the other school down the street, or Parks and Rec facility, or whatever. That's what we're doing a lot in terms of that type of school. And that's hard to tell on paper, so the annual survey that we do, we can't quite tell what the barriers are, and so it's developing those relationships, doing those site visits, and making sure that we can provide support. When we come in and smack hands around this stuff, we don't get any traction. And so we want to make sure that it feels like a priority and we feel like a partner.
In feeling like priorities, that was one of my pet peeves, is that a lot of schools could see that this was a priority to the physical education because they were so caught up in wanting to make sure that the tests would pass for academics. And so, in incorporating this, are there going to be guidelines that's basically saying, well, children need to have PE at least 3 times a week, or is that going to be spelled out so that schools?
Yeah, so the Healthy Schools Act does mandate the number of minutes that are required, and then has the graduation requirements as well for the high school grades. But that's what I was talking about, the bar is really, really high, it's the gold standard, and so I think we're trying to figure out, 2 years ago, 0 schools were meeting it. Last year, it was 10 schools, and so very slow progress, and so we need to figure out, we're doing a lot of work. This is one of my main areas. It's one of the biggest gaps and one of the hardest things to move forward. I think the good thing about it is we have made a lot of progress on a lot of fronts on education in the district, and I think if we want to make it to that next level, people are acknowledging the importance of that child work that needs to happen, and I think parents are very engaged in it. So that's been really helpful to get that input and help us think of it from all different angles and make sure that we're addressing everyone's concern, knowing it's a really challenging thing for schools.
So,
They're well intended and they're trying to make it work.
Go ahead, Joe, and then Mark.
So, I want to push back a little bit here because I think we're sending a mixed message to our students. The law is the law. We need to strive to meet it, not set a bar that's lower than the law. If we cannot meet the law, we need to work with the council and highlight where we're going to fall short and work to change and amend the law. Setting an example where we put forward as policymakers, it's okay to ignore the law is not acceptable for our students. So if we're going to set a benchmark that's good, but we're not going to be able to reach that gold standard and have a plan to get there, we'll need to go to the council. And I just want to be clear about that.
So I just want sorry to cut you off, Joe. I just want to clarify that the Healthy Different Schools Commission has been looking at potential amendments to the Healthy Schools Act for a while, and we're in those active discussions, and this is one of the key provisions we're looking at.
Absolutely, but I want to just be clear on the record that that sends a really mixed message, that it's okay to ignore some laws. It's not.
Absolutely, 100% agree. So with our subcommittee in particular, where there are advocates, researchers, LEAs at the table, we have created 2 main priorities with that subcommittee specifically around physical education and activity for this year, and wanted to look at what would the amendments be where we can really start to get some traction and create some flexibility and innovative models for kids to be getting more active in school, and then the standards themselves. And so the committee spent time doing both at the same time, knowing that it is a mixed message and we wouldn't want to move forward with something while the other thing is still lagging. And so we're kind of doing a joint effort. But that's a great point.
Mark?
Yeah, got a couple of questions, mostly focused around the physical activity. And this applies more to the charters than our traditional schools, but some traditional schools lack facilities as well. And I know earlier you said you will hopefully partner them with DPR. But many of our charters and some traditional schools are not that close to our recreation centers. So what is your plan? That's one of my questions. To find locations and arrangements for physical activity.
So there's a lot of great equipment that you can pop up and pull down. I was a gymnast in college and at GW, and we had to set up all the equipment for practice in the city, or drive an hour outside of the city. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things to do, and I think a lot of people in our schools are not aware of what they can purchase without having to need to get that access to a different facility than what they have. There's a lot of things that can happen in the classroom, particularly for the younger population. But there are options, and I think we need to help people explore those because they're not on the school's radar. So that's one thing.
Right, and the ones that are close to the recreation centers, do you have an understanding with DPR already, or have you been in discussions with them?
I mean, we've talked to them. I mean, the value is that we're all under the Deputy Mayor for Education, and so we're all kind of working towards a common goal. And so they're very interested in helping us move this forward. Most of the schools are making those connections and establishing those relationships. Where we get brought in is if a school's having trouble, and making sure that that conversation can happen.
Yeah, but have you had that discussion, or do you have that understanding now?
Yeah, we have connected at a high level, but where the relationships get most productive is when the manager of an individual recreation center and the principal of the school are connecting directly.
Right,
So
because
we've got the high level understanding in place with DPR, but it's the continuing to work through the implementation connections.
I asked that for a specific reason. When we were building Brookland Middle School, and I was on the SIT team, and our goal was to sort of partner with the recreation center. And there was tremendous pushback from DPR when it came down to the functionaries. The managers, the supervisors at DPR wanted nothing to do with the school, and they're adjacent. So my recommendation is get way ahead of it. I've got experience in this government, and it's not always at the top where you have these discussions, and then when you get down to the functionaries, and that's when they start fighting and nothing productive happens. So I would encourage you to get in front of them.
Absolutely, and I mean, it's not solely dependent on the TPR facility. There's a charter school that takes their kids out onto the hall to do PE. They utilize, the big open field space on the hall, and it's great.
No, I'm fine with
so
that.
it is
I'm just
figuring
saying get
out
in
what
front
are
of,
those options, if
yeah,
they-
but when they're close, just
Absolutely,
get in front of it early so you can have those discussions to eliminate that.
yeah.
Lastly, how are you going to reprimand the school when they're not meeting the requirements? And there are many that don't do it now because of financial reasons and other resource reasons. As a matter of fact, one of my daughter's schools, and the principal said, I just don't have the resources. And
Right, and
so
so-
how do we resolve that? As Joe said, if it's a fight that we need to fight,
Right.
we need to know up front. I just think policy that is not practical makes no sense.
Absolutely.
And I think too much of that happens.
I have not heard a school or a school leader or anyone who works in schools in the district say
No, I didn't
just
say
wanna do
don't care about it.
It is really well intended for people who are struggling to figure it out, and so, at least from a strategy approach, from my position and with the division of people that work for me, it's been more of a how can we help you, how can we connect you to resources, how can we look at your master schedule and figure out a way for you to fit PE in, how can we identify grant funding for you to fund a PE teacher. We have 2 large grants out right now. One is to fund PE teachers and one is to support physical activity programs. And so, you know, it's making those resources available for people who want to make it work but just can't on their own. I mean, it's a really hard place to be for a school leader, and you know, I strongly believe that the best way for us to get traction is to be that support and not, you know, providing any sort of penalty around it, but figuring out how to get them to the right place.
But what if they're still not doing it? I don't believe in just taking a stick. No, I'm not suggesting that.
So I think.
But when you have bad actors, there are times you've gotta, you know, for whatever reason, a principal may have his or her own agenda. But as Joe said, laws and rules are there for a reason.
So we agree, and again, this is one of the key reasons why we're looking at changes to the Healthy Schools Act, so that we can set the bar in a place that is feasible, and then that we are all in agreement about what that requirement is. Some of you who've seen the Healthy Schools Act may know when it was first passed, the requirement was much lower, and so we had the majority of schools passing the bar for a long time, and then there was an immediate jump up at a single point in time. So it went from a very low bar to a very high bar at one point in time, and when that jump happened, that was the first year, whereas Donna said no schools were meeting that bar, and then the following year 10 schools were meeting that bar in the entire district. So if we were, right now, just hypothetically, if somebody were to call schools out, you'd be calling out all the 10 schools across the city, and I just don't think that that would be effective. And so our focus has been on both how do we support schools in getting students the physical activity that we think ultimately is the outcome that matters, by providing as much more of it as we can, and really focusing on that improvement, and then also think about partnering around sort of what the bar should be appropriately, and working on those amendments. And we're glad to keep you all posted, and think certainly can work together on sort of advocating for those changes once we have a better sense of what they meant.
Well, I'd like to echo Mark's comments and just say, best intentions, no offense, but intentions don't get kids what they need. We need actual action. And if we can work together to build an enforcement mechanism that makes sense and isn't arbitrary, I think we'd like to work with you on that to make sure that students are getting what they need. So I'm happy to work with you, Mark, and with the team at Aussie to make sure that we're doing this right, and with Joe to make sure that we're doing this right and that schools are getting what they need and schools are being held accountable to providing that to the students. And if the law is wrong, we'll work with you to change that and to work with council. I don't want to spend much more time on this because we've hit on it a lot, but I think Ashley had a question, and then Ruth, and then I'd really like to get on to ESSA because I think we're going to spend a lot more time there than on this. Okay, so Ashley?
Just a quick question along the lines of what Mark and Joe were saying. When would we look at the enacting of these, and how are we going to help the schools that are going through the modernization, making sure that they're able to set the bar, because oftentimes they're not in their location that they're going to be in. Buying pop-up stuff is not necessarily a good use of money if they're only going to be there for a year or two. So it'll just be put away after that. So what are we doing, thinking about the schools that are being modernized to make sure that they can fit this, and or when are these going to be enacted to make sure that it's around those timelines?
So for the standards themselves, we would like them to be in place for implementation next school year.
Okay.
So get a vote from you all in March, so that schools have enough time to do that training, and teachers have enough time to do that development in preparation. I think, for the schools who are doing the modernization, most likely those kids still have access to part of their school or going to other schools, mostly on the DCPS
they have adequate fields or this, or they're getting bused to somewhere that they can give those, needs, so they are able to set the bar.
Great, Ruth, and then we'll move on to ESSA.
In the interest of moving on, let me just put this out as a placeholder rather than asking a question, but I was surprised actually to hear you talk about how some schools weren't doing PE because they said they can't afford it and you're helping them with grants, and I'm curious what that means about the UPSFF, because I assume that the per pupil funding that is also a law is supposed to cover that. Maybe it's not, but that's something I think we should look at.
Thank you so much.
Great. Anything else? If not, I'd like to move on to the ESSA discussion. Oh,
20 seconds.
Yes.
I was going to write you an email because I was trying to respect time, but for the good of all, if at the next time you talk to us, could you just link this to the bigger strategy of what everyone here is talking about, which is like the real practical implementation of making sure kids are getting adequate physical activity. Otherwise, it feels like to the public that we're pushing paper where there's been like a real actualized concern raised. So if you could help us link that so we can communicate that out to constituents, I think so.
Absolutely, I'm happy to come and talk about our larger strategy and the benchmarks that we've set and the metrics and goals that we have for our commission and the larger work.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much for your time, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
Happy New Year.
I'm gonna move to ESSA, which I believe we have a presentation from Aussie. Ruth, did you want comments before or after?
Well, we're gonna have a conversation about resolution. I imagine it should come after. I guess the one thing I would say before is that we're gonna have a new ESSA committee, and I just wanna welcome to it all three of our new members. Want to join it, and I am thrilled. And so our committee is going to be Lynette and Marcus and Ashley, and then our veteran members, Joe and Mark, and me will also be continuing. So it's a great, strong committee. And part of what we've been trying to do is both learn ourselves, figure out how to keep pushing the engagement, and feed our comments back to Aussie so that we can get into a real, a meaningful discussion, problem-solving, negotiation about how to move this forward. So we are very interested in seeing the new presentation and how you have taken into account the comments that we've passed on to you before in memos and testimony and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Go ahead. Hansel, you can be leading this?
I am.
Okay, great.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the new members for your first meeting. So I am going to try to move through this presentation pretty quickly, but I'm going to ask to be able to get through it because I think we've tried to be really thoughtful about the content, and I think we'll answer some of the questions that might have occurred even earlier. We'll be able to cover by the end. This is just a quick agenda for you all about where we're headed. So starting with just the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish here, just as a reminder to all of us, because I know we can get into the weeds pretty quickly, and just wanted to start with this big picture frame. So our current state of affairs in DC is really that we've had multiple models of accountability that are running in parallel with each other. We've obviously had the waiver system that OSSE has worked on with the State Board of Education that has been in place for a number of years. At the same time, the Public Charter School Board has had a performance management framework in place for 5 or more years now that applies only to our public charter schools. And the DCPS has had a strategic plan that includes identification of 40/40 schools, the 40 lowest performing schools in their eyes. So these multiple systems of accountability have really been running in parallel with each other. In addition to that, we've had information about schools in all these different places. And so the result, I think, has really been confusion for families and for schools. So schools are saying, if I'm a public charter school and I'm tier 2, but I'm a developing school in OSSE's framework, like what does that mean, right? And I am out in public and I'll hear parents talk about looking at pre-K3 programs for the first time and saying, for the public charter schools, I see these tier ratings, but for OSSE, I see these different labels, and the tier ratings don't apply to the DCPS schools. How do I know how to look at schools next to each other? And so this is part of the current situation that we're trying to address. And so where we want to go is a common model of school accountability for all schools in DC that is also jointly used, ideally, by multiple parties, so that we don't have these different frameworks running in parallel and causing confusion for families and for schools. As part of that common model, also then accurate identification of low-performing schools across both sectors, and then thoughtful supports and interventions to drive improvement in those low-performing schools, and integrated public reporting, so bringing a big phase of work to come around sort of the design of those report cards and how to make that information really accessible and useful for families, both from just the language we use to talk about things, to the graphics, to where it sits in terms of websites and searchability and all of those functions. So I just make that point to say, even though we're not talking about that today, that work is deeply important to us and it is coming.
Hansel, do you want us to wait till the end or ask questions?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. And so we have been working with you all and with a number of stakeholders throughout the past year, really, and we started by defining a number of accountability principles to guide our design process. And just a reminder about what those principles were are here. And so we had gone through multiple drafts of this and shared it with you all before, and we've made changes to these principles based on feedback. And our design work continues to be anchored in these different principles for us. So I just wanted to share with you all some of the details that I will share later in the presentation and how they connect to those principles that we've been talking about. So one really critical principle is obviously a focus on all students, not just any specific group of students, not leaving any group of students out, focus on all students. And so some of the ways in which you see that built into our system proposal at this point is that overall school ratings include substantial weight on the performance of specific groups of students as well as the performance of all students on average. So this has been one of the big pieces that has been missing, in my view, from some of the current accountability systems, is they don't necessarily look in a separate way at the performance of students in special education or the performance of African American students or the performance of English learners, and weight that in addition to the performance of all students on average. So that is one big component of our framework. Another component is there are multiple indicators that value growth for all students, including those starting furthest behind. And so we believe that there is a need to focus on students achieving at a particular level, achieving at the college and career ready level, but it's also critical to look at the students who are making improvements from any starting point. And we believe our framework balances both of those needs. And we've heard pretty consistently from stakeholders that both feel quite important. And as we've been looking at what other states do, we are seeing a balance of both factors across what other states are doing. And then another feature, and these are not the only ones, they are just some representative examples, but another feature that looks at the focus on all students is for schools that serve students in early childhood, a proportion of the overall framework is based on how well they're serving those youngest learners. So the framework doesn't just start at third grade when PARCC testing starts, we've included class in particular. And so again, this idea that both performance and growth matter. So we have multiple measures of performance and growth in the system. So we maintain a clear focus about the level where we believe students need to perform. The level 4 on PARCC is the college and career ready level that has been adopted by you all as the definition of proficiency in the district. And so we are including that students meeting or exceeding at that bar at a high weight. We also have at a lesser weight the students approaching meeting or exceeding expectations, so those level of students scoring at the 3+ level. And then we also finally recognize the value of students that are making progress, and we've heard very clearly from the board how important this is to you all. And so we've actually included 2 different types of growth metrics at the school-wide level. One is MGP, median growth percentile, which looks at the level of growth that is happening for students regardless of starting point. So it's looking at the type of growth that is happening no matter where you're starting relative to the performance thresholds. And then actually complementing that with an absolute growth measure, which is a different type of growth measure. Because while MGP I think is a very helpful measure, one of the drawbacks of it is that it is a relative measure. And so there are always the median MGP, the MGP for the city as a whole is always 50. And so there's some schools that are above 50 and some schools that are below 50. So in a year, for example, where every single school in DC made a lot of progress, some of those would still have a low MGP, just because they made less progress than others. And there are benefits to that, but we think it's also helpful to complement that with an absolute growth measure that considers improvement in performance for students at every level and isn't zero-sum in the same way. So we've built in both those types of growth frameworks. And we also have both performance and growth built into the English language proficiency domain. So we're required under federal law to have a different assessment called, the one we use is called WIDA Access, that measures English language proficiency. So literally just the rate at which you're proficient in English language. And so we've included both performance and growth when it comes to English language proficiency. And then the next principle is around multiple measures of school quality and student success. And we know that, again, this is one that is deeply important to the board from the feedback we've heard from you. We've also heard this consistently from families, schools, and community. And so the high school framework values education educational opportunities that schools are making available to students, including AP and IB, and looking at both performance and participation in those metrics. So we know that schools have really focused on having more students access AP, which is great, but we also need to look at sort of how successful students are being in that, so it's not just sort of forcing all students to take something without actually preparing them. We've included a measure for enrollment that gives schools credit for establishing an environment where students and families want to stay. And this is a metric that has been used previously, again, in these multiple systems running in parallel. It's been used to date by both the public charter sector and DCPS. I think that just shows the extent to which both sectors have valued this as an outcomes measure that shows something about the environment that is created. And then given the strong correlation and the real research background we've seen between attendance and student outcomes, our system rewards schools that are have students accessing as much instructional time as possible. And so the attendance metric that has been used most commonly in DC is in-seat attendance. So we are retaining that metric, but we're also adding a new metric of quality instructional time, which is based on the percent of students who are present for 90% or more of the school year. So some of you may have heard some of the discussion around chronic absenteeism. This is basically the positive side of chronic absenteeism, students who are present chronically, basically. And there's a lot of, again, strong research behind that metric. The next principle is around supporting comparability and equity. So again, this importance of allowing for comparable results between different types of schools and equity in it. And so we're trying to build a system that is workable for schools and LEAs in the sense that they see that, I think this is actually pertinent to the discussion we were just having about the Healthy Schools Act time minutes. If you set a bar that feels unreasonable, then people are not going to feel the same urgency versus setting a bar that is high but is feasible and that causes you to then want to strive for that goal. So part of that is using measures that are available, understood, and common across sectors. And I think this is something in the September memo that summarized your community feedback that we really heard as a theme around not having too many measures, staying really focused and clear about which measures we include. And then also we have sought to maintain and balance fairness in reporting. So there are two things we've built in here. One is an N size, so a minimum N of 10 in this case, for accountability and reporting. So this means, for example, if you only had 8 students in a third grade math, you're taking a third grade math test in your school, we would not report out those results for reasons of protecting student privacy. And that's a pretty common, everyone sets a minimum N size in these games generally. But the second thing we've built in is a feature in the system that I'll actually walk through in more detail later, because it's a little bit complicated, but it's building in another protection that is a structural consideration that again both addresses student privacy but also gets to the fact that our schools are very different. Our schools differ from each other in the range of student populations they're serving, and we've heard some concerns from you all about what happens with mid-year mobility and transitions, right? What happens if there are students leaving a school mid-year, and we think this new feature will help introduce some greater stability to the system and allow for different schools that serve different populations to be accurately measured. So again, I'll go more into that feature and I'll call your attention back to it when I get to that point of the slides. The last part of this section is just noting that given current data availability and systems, there are some measures that we've discussed both with you all and with other stakeholders that are not currently built into our proposal for the system, but that we continue to keep exploring in the future, pending further data analysis and policy consideration. So for example, we don't currently have a measure that works at a growth measure that works at the high school level. We've not had sufficient data to calculate an MGP at the high school level, and so we are continuing to explore what a high school measure could look like and exploring potential alternatives to MGP that might allow us to have a high school measure, including looking at value-added models, which is a different way of calculating growth, but similar to MGP, looks at the growth of all students regardless of starting point. Or exploring things like a PSAT to SAT growth measure, which is another idea that some folks have put out there. We've also heard from you about the strong interest in including DC science. We are also certainly committed to science as a content area, and we're open to exploring the feasibility of including it in the future. As you all know, we've been transitioning to a new next generation science standards aligned assessment, and because that assessment is still so new, and we have not yet been able to do standard setting on that assessment or report out results, we think it's a little bit early to include it at this point in time, but we are committed to continuing to explore that. And then there's some additional early childhood academic measures that are used in the PMF that including IRED currently only used in one sector and not the other, at least not consistently. There are things we could keep exploring but aren't ready to include at this point. Around graduation rate, one measure, again, that has generated a lot of discussion is the idea of a ninth grade on track to graduate measure. So this basically looks at the percent of ninth graders who have accumulated enough credits to be on track to graduate. And that's something that we are very interested in. I think there's a lot of stakeholder interest in this as well. We just don't currently have a mechanism at OSSE to collect that data or vet it or verify it. And so we don't think it makes sense to include for the first year in the system, but are keeping it actively on the table for the future. And finally, around school quality and student success, again, I know these are areas that you all have expressed interest in around dual enrollment, career technical certification, and around surveys. And we are certainly open to continuing to explore these opportunities, but we don't think we're ready to include at this point in time. So I want to get in a little bit to the structure proposal. And so later in the presentation, I'll get into the specific metrics we are including that would roll up into this structure. But I wanted to start with this bigger picture structure proposal because it's sort of one of the biggest things that is new since the earlier straw man that you all saw back in September. And so our proposal here is that for a given school, we would calculate an index score that would apply. And we would run all the same metrics through each of these boxes, basically. So we would calculate certain metrics, including PARCC results, growth, attendance, etc., for the all students group in a school. And then we would separately calculate the same metrics for particular groups of students or subgroups. And I know that term is not one that any of us in the room find ideal. It is the term that is used in the federal law, and so we use it here in this presentation. So for example, I would run all the same metrics just looking at my students with IEPs to see how they did specifically. And then what we would do is the subgroups that don't meet the minimum number of points possible, which again, I'll get to in just a minute, would not count to the school's final score. So let's say you only have a few English learner students in your school, you don't have enough points possible, that score would not contribute to your framework score.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, the minimum is the 10 kids that are part of the minimum N, or it's different?
It's different, yeah. So let's say you had enough.
You don't need to explain now, but
I'm about to actually walk through it. So then the final score for a school would be a weighted average of the all student score and the applicable subgroup scores. And though this is just a proposed weighting that we put out there, so we would weight each of the individual race and ethnicity groups at 5%, economically disadvantaged students at 5%, English language learners at 5%, students in special education at 10%, and then the all students group at 75%. So again, going back to that idea of focus on all students, we think it's important to look at not only the overall averages of students, but how particular groups of students are performing, and that will promote a focus on all types of students within your school. And by calculating it this way as separate frameworks, it calls additional attention and focus to the groups, to those particular subgroups of students. So for a little bit more about technically how this works, and again, this slide gets into some of it. So again, calculating separately for each subgroup ensures that transparency, and it emphasizes equity, and ensures comparability of scores. So what that would allow you to do is you could look at the special ed framework score at one school compared to another school and see if I'm just interested in how a school is serving their students with special needs, I can easily look at those then side by side. And again, we'd have to get into sort of all the features to make that information accessible. This calculation makes it more possible than having to look at each individual metric by subgroup. And then this idea of, to Ruth, to your question, we've built in both a minimum N of 10 and a minimum number of points possible, and I think you're going to see why a little bit more in the next slide. And then in terms of why those particular weights and why we chose them, there's no magic to them, but just to explain our thinking, we think it's important to place substantial weight on the performance of specific groups of students. And again, one of the big differences, I think there was a great dialogue last week about the performance management framework and some of the lessons learned from having the PMF now in the charter sector for so many years. I think there are a lot of strengths to the PMF, but one of the biggest drawbacks in my mind is the PMF doesn't look at the performance of individual groups of students. It only focuses on the all students average. And so this way, this move to go from no weight on it to 25% being on it, we think places substantial weight on that performance. And it prioritizes outcomes for those groups of students who tend to be furthest behind when we look at our current results. So this walks through sort of what we mean by the minimum N of 10 and why it's different from the minimum points possible threshold. So this is just just a hypothetical school. So if you pick a school, and this hypothetical school is predominantly African American, and serves economically disadvantaged and special education students. This school does not serve many Asian students, Hispanic students, white students, or English language learners. And so for white students, you can see that there's not actually enough white students to even meet an N of 10. Let's say there are 8 white kids in this school, so they don't meet the N of 10, so we don't even calculate any individual metric for them or report any of them. We still score the tests, obviously, but we don't publicly report that because the group size is so small and we start to jeopardize confidentiality. For Hispanic and Latino students, let's say that there are 15 total students in the school, and so they are above that N of 10 and in certain metrics. And so in the in-seat attendance and the 90% plus attendance areas, there are more than 10 students included, and so we would report those results. But there are not enough students to meet the N of 10 in all the other areas, and so we would not report on those other areas. So we would calculate just those 2 attendance metrics for the Hispanic and Latino students. And then when it came to WIDA access, that English language proficiency test, actually across the entire school, there were not enough students who took that test, and so we would not calculate that metric for any of the groups of students at all. What that then means is if we set the minimum number of points possible at 50, the Hispanic Latino score would not contribute to the school's final score, even though some of the metrics were calculated for Hispanic and Latino students. So you can see they met the N size in just a couple of places. There are only 2 check marks in that column, but they didn't have enough points earned in that framework to contribute to the overall score, as opposed to the Black students or the special education students who did meet that minimum points possible threshold. And so in order to calculate the final score for that school, what you would do is place the 75% weight on the all students group, 5% on African American students, 5% on economically disadvantaged students, and then 10% on students in special education, and arrive at a total score of 66. And again, the English language learner students are not included because they didn't meet that minimum number of points possible at 50. Now, what this example doesn't tell you, and what we're still in the stage of designing, is what does that score of 66 mean? What category does that put you in? How many final categories should you have, and then what category does that put you in? And that is still to be determined, but part of what you need to know in order to get to those final stage decisions is making some of these more interim decisions. So again, it's not that these decisions are final, but that we're working with you all and with other stakeholders to share our thinking at sort of every stage of the process. And one interim step is to determine, all right, which individual metrics do you include, but also how do those individual metrics roll up in some way into some kind of summative score. And so this proposal that I just been walking through is our proposal for what a structure would look like that looks at not only the average performance of all students, but also calls out the specific part of the performance of subgroups of students. So then getting a little bit more into the specific metrics we've included. So the thing that would go, just to go back for a second, the actual metrics, the actual elements that go into each box here are what's included in this next section. So we would, for example, this is the framework we're proposing for middle schools. And so for middle schools, what we would calculate is academic achievement weighted at 40% of the overall total, with PARC at the 3+ level weighted at 15 points, 40, PARC at the 4+ level weighted at 25 points. And then weight academic growth at 40%. So weight growth the same proportion as achievement. And the growth measure would again be split between median growth percentile, which is this relative measure, and a new absolute growth metric, which is the other half. And then the school quality and student success bucket would count for 15%. Of that 15%, half would go to the 90% plus attendance metric. Again, because of the strong research base behind it. And the other half would be split between in-seat attendance, the other attendance metric, and re-enrollment. And then English language proficiency would be weighted at 5%. The next framework is for elementary schools and for pre-K-8 schools. And this is quite similar to the middle school framework with the addition of class in the school quality and student success bucket. So for those of you who are new to this, class is a instrument that we use in our pre-K-4 classrooms across the city. And it looks at 3 big domains: classroom organization, instructional support, And then for high schools, again, while we would love to have a growth measure, we don't currently have one available. And so in the high school bucket, we don't have the growth domain, but we weight academic achievement at 50%, rather than having in the other frameworks achievement plus growth totaled up to 80%. So here the academic achievement bucket is worth 50%. It includes part measures at the same levels, or at similar levels, and then it also includes ACT, SAT. Again, we look at both performance and participation on those assessments, and then AP, IB, that access to higher level coursework and performance on them. The school quality and student success bucket is weighted a little bit higher than in elementary and middle schools at 25%, with the same distribution within it. So 90% plus attendance at half the weight, and the other remaining points split between in-seat attendance and re-enrollment. English language proficiency continues to be weighted at 5%, and then graduation rate is weighted at 20%. We've included in here, we share the commitment, and we've heard your all's feedback around the importance of 5 and 6 year graduation metrics, and we completely agree that the schools that are serving those students who are taking longer than 4 years are incredibly important. It's actually written into the federal guidelines that you have to include 4-year ACGR, and you have to weight it more than any other type of graduation rate metric. So in our proposal, we've weighted 4-year ACGR at 10%, and then split the remaining points between 5-year ACGR and a new alternate grad metric. The reason we're saying alternate grad metric rather than just saying 6-year ACGR is we saw when we ran the 6-year ACGR calculation that it doesn't actually pick up that many more students than 5-year does, just because of the logistics of how that business rule is calculated. The way ACGR is calculated, you start with a 9th grade cohort, and then you freeze that cohort in place, and then you see if they have an additional year at 5 years or an additional 2 years at 6 years, do they then graduate? But if there are students who weren't in that cohort, either because, let's say, they were in an earlier cohort, they left school and now are re-engaging later, or have other factors, they wouldn't be picked up by the 6-year ACGR. And so the alternate grad metric is a way of capturing any students who are outside the 4-year group, who the school is helping graduate. How do you pick those up and include them? So we've actually seen that it is more beneficial to schools than just doing a 6-year ACGR straight calculation. So really quickly on next steps, I know that's a ton of content. We've had the December 21st public meeting, obviously, and I think that was a really strong and active panel discussion there, and great questions from you all. We're talking right now at this working session. At our January 18th public meeting, I know we're expecting additional public testimony. And then our plan is, fingers crossed, that by January 30th, we will have a full draft of the state plan, which includes accountability, but also includes many other portions that are required. And we will launch an extended public comment period from January 30th to March 3rd. And our plan during that time period is starting on February 6th. So releasing the plan and then giving people a few days to read it. And then starting on February 6th, working with you all to host meetings in each of the 8 boards that will be co-hosted by the State Board and OSCE to allow for engagement and public comment on the comprehensive state plan. Within that engagement period, also at the February 1st working session, continuing discussions, and then working towards a vote in March, and your request of a special vote. On February 15th, we expect that to be continued public testimony, and then just FYI for you all, OSCE is hosting an LEA Institute, another one in our ongoing series on February 28th, and we're really using that opportunity to continue to dive deeply into SL with our LEAs, and so it's one more chance for them to also engage in the public comment process. And then from March 3rd to 15th, based on all that feedback, we would revise the state plan. We're hoping that you all will meet on March 22nd in special session to vote on the state plan, and then on April 3rd, we would submit the state plan to the U.S. Department of Ed. We'd hear back within 120 days. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to open it up for questions. Jen?
Ruth and I'll kind of share coordination, but I'd like Ruth to open discussion, and then we'll move to Mark for the first question. I know I've got a bunch, so let's just start with Ruth.
Okay, well first, so I appreciate all the comments and the effort to respond to some of what we've raised. That said, the framework in terms of the weights is exactly what it was when we first made comments and before we had all the false testimony. And here's what let me just say, and here's what I'm concerned about, and I want to get your reaction to this. Right now, 80% of the schools evaluation is based on test scores, and half of that is based on proficiency. That has not changed. And I believe I was at an earlier LEA meeting, and we were working with a consultant who was going to run a lot of models so that you could sort of see how all this played out. So I'm curious about how that modeling plays out, and I want to put some particular examples in front of you, because these are the examples I think we should bring out to our board meetings. So let's say we go to let's talk about a school where the kids who are entering, let's pick a middle school, we could pick anything, but let's say the 6th graders who enter, and we have a lot of schools like this, let's say something in the single digits are proficient. And many to most are at 1s or 2s. I believe we have a number of schools in that situation, am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's say those schools are really effective. Let's say they raise almost all of their low 1s to high 1s. Let's say they raise almost all of their high 1s to middle 2s, and let's say they raise all their low 2s to high 2s, and then they raise some of their 2s to 3s and some of their 3s to 4s. The likelihood is in that school there will still be no students at 5. I'm talking about an extraordinary school that has moved kids really an amazing amount upwards from a very low level. In all likelihood, they will have no 5s, they will still have no 4s, and they'll have a few 3s. So my question to you is, given that half of their score is going to be on their proficiency levels, which will be very low, how much progress would that school have to make? How much better than average would that school have to be in order not to end up in, let's say, the bottom 20, 25, 30% of schools? In other words, it's an extraordinary school, the kids are entering at low achievement levels. According to your modeling, could they make it into being a high, regarded as an effective school?
I think I have a few thoughts to make. I think first, on the idea that there has not been any changes since the first straw man, I think that is just not accurate.
I said in terms of the numbers, I was very specific, in terms of the 80-20 and the 40-40, that's what I said.
On that particular piece,
And that's what I'm saying, that is the basic structure of the proposal that we responded to, and that has not been changed. And I thank you for some of the other littler changes within that, but.
So, I will say that I think there is a difference between carefully considering all of the feedback we are receiving and making changes to every single piece. I think the reason I started with that broad frame of why we believe in the importance of common accountability is I think that coming to a common system that is bought into across our city and provides a common language or framework for our parents and for policymakers and for all of us to use in our schools is so important that there are trade-offs that we are all making and choices we are all making. And it might not be the system that any one of us as individuals would pick ourselves if we were designing from scratch exactly the system that we thought belonged, but there is value in that commonality. I'm not saying that that means there are strong principles behind these decisions as well, and I absolutely appreciate and acknowledge that, but I just want to note that that is one of the key things that is driving our process, that the promise of commonality for our parents is so key that is really what we are striving for here. I think the second thing I would say is in terms of the weight on our growth and proficiency, again, we've been scanning as every state has been releasing their plan, and I think of the 12 states that we've seen put plans out so far, none of them has growth weighted more than proficiency. One state actually has proficiency rated more than growth, and the others all have it rated equally. So again, I'm not saying that's the only driver, and we'll continue to look at every other state, but that is the trend we are seeing to date. The third thing I would say in terms of 80% of the weight being on test scores, our previous system was, I think, 100% based on test scores, they were, right? And so we know that 80% is substantial. I think that people, what we've heard pretty consistently is that these results matter to folks, and other things matter as well, and that's why we built in the 20%. But we think that the 80% weight is actually appropriate in our view. And then your question about the researchers and the research we've been doing. The research we've been doing is specifically around median growth percentile and how that functions versus other types of school growth metrics like value-added measures. Those tend to be the two most common types of school level growth measures that are used in other places. And that research is still ongoing. We are thinking about ways to brief folks on that. It is incredibly technical. I mean, I felt, even as I was walking through this presentation, how technical this presentation felt to me. And I will tell you, the research is like maybe 2 levels deeper, more technical. And so we're still trying to parse through the findings on our end and think about how we can translate it and communicate about those. But that would be whether, if we were to go forward with any changes there, it would belong in this bucket of the median growth percentile. If this framework stays as it is, that research was around sort of what this bucket should be, whether it should be median growth percentile or we should switch this bucket to something like a value-added measure. So it's pretty specific to that area. And then I think in terms of your question about sort of, part of your question I think comes back to, I think the fundamental question we are trying to answer is, what is our opinion of a good school? And I think at the heart of all this is that there are very widely varying opinions about that. Part of what you're saying is that a school that makes tremendous growth, even if its students are not over that threshold, in your mind is part of what defines an excellent school. And I think that definition is perfectly valid and reasonable, and it's one that I know a lot of people hold. I will tell you that other folks hold very different opinions. So I was talking to somebody who worked deeply on the New York City accountability system, where they had rated all of their schools on an A to F scale. And there's a school that was rated as an A in their system. I don't know all the factors that went into it, but it was rated as an A when the overall outcomes were incredibly low. And this person just felt so deeply and fundamentally that that was a broken system and that it was not telling the truth to parents about the results of that school. I think that is another strongly held, valid, reasonable viewpoint. And this is the range of opinions we are grounded with here. And so this is really, I think, why these discussions are can be heated, can be passionate, because we all bring a lot of strong opinions to it. But it is ultimately about coming to aiming for consensus, trying to come to a collective view of sort of what we are valuing in schools. And that was part of why we started, knowing that things would get really tough, starting with some common principles. And so again, one of those common design principles at the beginning was this idea of valuing both growth and performance. We can differ about sort of what exactly that would look like and what the balance is, but I think at the beginning there was pretty strong consensus among our stakeholders that both of those principles matter. And so this is how we've chosen to reflect that. You all have expressed that, or at least right now you're expressing, and your previous memos have expressed that you believe a different balance is appropriate. But I think it's not that we disagree on the underlying principle, it is that we are disagreeing a little bit on the actual manifestation.
I'm just going to respond very quickly, and then I'll butt out and open it up. I just want to say a couple things. One, I think we all would like to have a common framework that was used across the city, but I don't think that's a higher priority than having a measurement system that can be regarded as fundamentally accurate and fair. So I just want to say that. Second, you say it used to be 100% proficient, and it's 100% testing, and now it's down to 80% testing. What I want to say is the federal law used to require 100%. That's why we have 100%. An enormous wave of criticism of that changed the law so that people now don't have to do 80%. They can do around 50%. So I would suggest that what you're pinning us to is something very, very high compared to what is now allowed. I just want to say that. And the third thing I just want to say on this question of people can vary on whether it's reasonable to say this much growth or this much proficiency, I'm going to say maybe this one person in New York disagreed with that that particular rating, but I think there would not be a lot of people who would agree. Now, I asked the question, given this rating system, is it possible for a school with mainly low-achieving kids, you know, that means a high-poverty school, I'm asking whether there's any possibility that school, no matter how well it is functioning and how effective it's teaching, is there any possibility that that school could possibly get a high rating? And if the answer isn't yes, I don't think most people would say that's a fair system. And then I think what we need to do is have a negotiation. You're saying people are all over the place on it. They are all over the place on it. And that's why there needs to be a negotiation about where do we put this spot.
So I
It
think
hasn't changed since the beginning, that's what I'm saying, Dawn.
So I would just say a couple of things there. I think one is in terms of where that school would fall and sort of what the ultimate rating would be. And part of my point here is that we don't know yet because that's not the stage that we propose. In this example that I walked through, this hypothetical school has a final score of 66. But whether 66 is in the top group or the bottom group, and is that the top group out of 5 or the middle group out of 4, like we don't know yet. That is sort of the next stage of the design process, right? So we're still thinking that through. So I can't answer your question right now in terms of mathematically how possible it is. I think the other point of sort of weighted growth and achievement is, I think the flip side of what you're saying is if there's a high performing school in terms of achievement that is not making strong growth with their students, that is also weighted here, right? And that is important, I think, for folks to know as well. And so that weighting is part of what we're factoring in. And again, what that would do to the points, where that would put the school, I think not yet determined. But I think those are additional considerations in addition to just the metric weights. And part of why I brought up just the changes we've made since the last time we almost saw this straw man is, I think as part of this question of sort of what makes a good school, I think in addition to sort of which metrics you include and how you weight them, one of our big considerations from the beginning has been, how do you think about the performance of specific groups of students versus the group of all students, right? And so when you think about, let's say there's a hypothetical school that is doing a great job, to your point, growing all students, let's say it also has high achievement when you look at its overall results. But when you look at its students with IEPs, it's not doing well. What does that mean, right? When their students with IEPs make up, say, 5% of the school, so it's not enough to sway the overall results. When you look at just the overall averages, it looks like the school is doing great, but when students with IEPs are not doing well, what should that mean? How do you call it out? What should that mean in terms of the results? Do you call that school excellent or not? Which, how would you rank it in terms of, how would you categorize it? And so a lot of our work between the original straw man you all saw and this updated version, in addition to making some changes to the weights, what was included where and so on, was around this proposal of framework for how you would both look at the performance of all students and you would look at the performance of different groups of students, and how you would do that in a way that's quote unquote fair and balanced in terms of looking at schools that serve really different populations. And just to give you a sense of how complex this is, part of the pushback we've gotten is in DC, we have a lot of schools, for example, where almost all of the students are African American and almost all of the students are economically disadvantaged. And so schools are saying to us, you're saying you're looking at multiple boxes, but our all students group is our subgroup also, right? And that is the case for many of our schools. At the same time, though, not every category is like that, right? English language learners is not like that. Special education is not like that. And there are schools where it's some Black students and some economically disadvantaged students. And so how you balance a framework that works for all of those things is one of the big things we worked on again. And part of our proposal here was not just these overall weights, but again, that idea of a minimum points possible that sort of allows for different considerations to come into play. And then just to give you all a sense of another factor that we're weighing here, I mean, around sort of like, again, this question of what makes a good school and how, to what extent you incorporate the performance and growth of the groups of students. Some people have said that they feel like this weight of English language learners is too high at 5% because the overall metrics also include English language proficiency for every group at 5%, right? And so English language proficiency is in some ways, English language learners are sort of incorporated in 2 different ways in the system. And part of that is based on what's federally required, that you have to calculate English language proficiency as part of the main framework. And part of that is our belief that it's both important to look at English language proficiency as a strand, but also look at the performance of English language learners as a group, as a whole, across all different types of categories. So I think that just, again, that there are the ways in which we're balancing the focus on growth and achievement and trying to be really balanced about what we're bringing into factor into the school performance. Part of it is through the weights and which metrics we include, but part of it is also through these other structural factors. Sorry, Jack, I responded for longer than I meant.
I'd love to get you, Karen, but I promise Mark will be done next.
She said 80%. The weighting is not 80% for the academic achievement.
But it's
80% for testing.
40 achievement and 40% growth, which combined is 80% for pre-high school. High school is a little different. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
But also, I don't think much changed, but I'm not gonna argue that.
That's been stated and discussed and will continue to be discussed by all of us. But Mark, you've been very patient. I'd like you to have some time.
At the rate of that answer. And I want to be fair to my other colleagues, so I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to narrow some of it down. On page 11, I've got in reference to the discussion part on the graduation rate and the school quality and student success. I think I get why you can't include the ninth grade on track to graduate, but at another time I'd like to discuss how I think you can. But on the school quality and student success part, what does it mean when you say explore, first of all, and then what are the challenges, if there are any, to including them? And what's your rationale? I just need to know why you, because I think those are all reasonable areas of discussion.
Sure. So I'll speak to the first two first. So dual enrollment and career technical certification are often, when people talk about sort of access to advanced coursework and opportunities for high school students, they often talk about AP/IB, but also dual enrollment and also career technical certifications. So there might be a student who doesn't want to take an AP class, but does want to take a dual enrollment class so that they're earning high school credits and college credits at the same time, for example. And we agree that those opportunities are incredibly important. We do lots of programming at OSSE to facilitate that and financial support for it. But the challenge in including it in the system is sort of what is then the outcome measure, right? On AP/IB and ACT, SAT, you've heard that we're looking at both participation and performance. We could track participation in dual enrollment, but it's harder to say what's the performance outcome that we would include that wouldn't cause everybody to just enroll kids without making it a meaningful experience. So that's the barrier on dual enrollment. On career technical certification, similarly, the bar is just not as clearly defined. There are really wide-ranging certificates. One of the most common certificates right now that our high schools use is around Microsoft certification, which is useful, but it's essentially proficiency in the Microsoft Office suite, so Excel and Word and PowerPoint and so on, which would be helpful in preparing for us presentations. Or to use PowerPoint all the time, but it's not the same as right. There are some certifications that actually are a credential you need to get a particular job, or that set you up on a particular career or technical education track. And there's not always, I think, there may be a ranking system out there. I would confess that I'm not as up to speed in this area, but it's not as clearly defined sort of what success would look like and how you define different certifications from each other. So the explore part is that we believe that these are incredibly important. Again, there's a lot of programming at OSSE to continue to support these things happening. In terms of how you allocate them in the accountability system, assign points to them, and then collect the data at OSSE, and then be able to verify that data is all sort of up in the air. Around surveys, just the last point, and again, it's been the subject of a lot of discussion, and I know a lot of interest from the board. I think our thing there has been, I think there have been a lot of different aspects raised when it comes to surveys. Part of our thinking there has been, there are a lot of climate surveys that are currently used in schools and have different, that schools are committed to in different ways. And so that thinking about sort of what each of those different surveys measure and how you collect that data and compare it, how you sort of look at equivalencies between different types of surveys, what should those surveys be accounted for or used for, I think all of that still seems very open-ended in an area where I know there are a wide range of opinions in all of this stuff, but I think in particular, like wide range of views there. And we just think it would take more time and more exploration to look at that one before again including it for points in the system.
Hey, are we not, I know you mentioned Microsoft Office on career and technical. Do we have schools teaching A+ and Cisco?
I believe so. I couldn't tell you offhand, but we have a number of different career academies, including computer science career academies. There are health science ones, hospitality career academies, and so we have career academies in a wide range of areas. There's also lots of AP computer science course seeking happening in our schools, so I think there's a lot around technology.
Just how do we follow up with some of these other questions, like on the school surveys? And I don't want to take up a lot of time from my other members, but I just want to make sure that we can have some back and forth, like on the 9th grade graduation track and that. And there's a number of other questions, but those two specifically.
Yeah, so I think we can continue to, certainly I expect these to be an ongoing topic of discussion in our working sessions, our panel discussions, and so on. I think we wanted to be pretty clear about sort of what we feel the limitations are operationally and OSCE in terms of the first year of the system. That said, I think in our state plan, one of the things we're considering is putting a defined point. You all know we're always committed to continuous improvement of our system, but building into our state plan formally saying at some point in time, you know, at this point, we can revisit our system, continue to explore additional metrics, and then add potential additional, then at that point forming whether to include additional metrics or not. So that's one thing we are considering in particular. If there are things we decide we just cannot get to right now, that we put a clear marker in the ground about when we can revisit and make additional discussions, just to keep folks all accountable to continue that discussion.
One thing that we could do, which I was gonna raise with our committee, is that the committee could actually become a point of contact for this sort of collecting all the questions, and then we could pass them on and sort of create a good set of questions that you guys could respond to, so that's a process point.
Okay, thank you. That's a great one. And to follow up on Mark's points is, the board is always well-intentioned and OSCE is always well-intentioned to keep conversations going on, but they frequently fall off, and that's from both of our sides. And so we need to figure out a way between the two of us to build in a mechanism that will automatically ensure that these issues are followed up on. Keeping in mind that the experts that have testified before us about these plans have told us the first plan that you do under this new system should be fairly streamlined and fairly simple, because your state education agency is going to have to spend a lot of time understanding how to get the data done and working on the technical aspects of it, and it can be added to in future years. So we've just got to figure out some way, whether it's an agreement, whether it's a calendar, whether it's part of the actual regulation that it must be looked at again at a time certain. We need to nail that down, because I think these are really important pieces, which is why they're included in this parking lot. So I'm going to jump in and then I'm going to pass to Marcus. But am I correct that the end size that used to be 25 is now 10?
Yeah. So that's an excellent point, because in the past we technically had two different end sizes, but they really sort of functioned as one, and the higher one because of that.
Right.
Previously in the past, we actually technically had an N of 10 for public reporting and an N of 25 for accountability purposes. What happened is, because I'm going to mess this up, but basically those lines got blurry, and so we ended up using the N of 25 generally. But having two different N sizes for reporting versus accountability is incredibly confusing. It means you could look up the third grade math score at a school in two different places and see two different numbers.
No, I just wanted to thank you. I don't want to beat this to death. I just want to thank you for choosing the lower number and making sure that we're sticking to it and that we're consistent on that. I think that is a terrific improvement. Also including two different growth measures. We'll continue to have discussion about what the appropriate weight for those growth measures is, but having two separate growth measures I think is really important. I'll just ask one quick question and then I'll pass to Marcus, which is, other than in-seat attendance and the 90% attendance rate, what are the metrics for the pre-K 3 through 2nd grade that are included in this plan? Because before assessments start, we need some sort of mechanism for accountability for those really low grades, because we know that if students aren't on track by kindergarten or 1st grade, they're never ever going to be up. It is so much harder to get them on track.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. So one thing is for schools that have pre-K, class is one of the big ones. That has been the main pre-K metric that we've used to date in the city to look at the quality of our pre-K programs, both in schools and in our CBO settings. So including class here is actually a pretty big step, because it's rare for state education agencies to include something outside of the 3 to 12 sort of area that's governed by us, ESEA. So class is one, and then these other metrics will be calculated specifically for pre-K 3 and 4 students and pulled out so that you could see the attendance rates for those groups versus other groups.
I'd really caution you on the re-enrollment piece, if we could touch on that for just a little bit, because your neighborhood school of right does not require pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 as a district student. The way I understand it is you're entitled to seat for pre-K 3 and pre-K 4, but not necessarily at your neighborhood school of right. That only starts in kindergarten. So I think that re-enrollment, we just need to make very sure when you're running your modeling that re-enrollment number doesn't get out of whack between pre-K 4 and kindergarten.
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't know the specifics how we've looked at that, but again, because re-enrollment is a metric that DCPS has used, we can learn more from sort of how they've done it. And I think you all may have Watson, who's joined our team
Yes.
as Deputy Chief of Staff. She used to be over data at DCPS, and so we will follow up with her and talk much more about that piece. To your point about sort of other types of academic measures between pre-K and second grade, the early childhood PMF that PCSD rolled out this year for the first time does include additional assessments that are taken at those in kindergarten, first and second grade. But again, those are not state required, they're not funded by the state, and they're not the same in public charter schools and in DCPS, which is our reason for not including them. Here, again, those were on our list for the parking lot to continue exploring to see, because DCPS also uses similar assessments. They're just not the same ones, so could we look at some kind of equivalency between those in the future?
John, also
So
just so you
then
know, access starts in kindergarten, so
Okay.
that is pre when club starts.
Okay, and I would just add real quick, there is no requirement that students have access to preschool and pre-K. We claim to have universal access in the city, but there's some debate about that still.
Can you back up, Justin, what you just said? So the access is used instead of part in kindergarten?
They're totally different purposes. So one is measuring English language proficiency. I was just pointing out so that domain that's measuring the acquisition of English as a language, that starts earlier. So
Gotcha.
it's not Rick versus Park where the first year testing for content mastery starts in third grade. For English language proficiency, it starts with kindergartners. So for
So
pre-K,
there's nothing, to answer your question,
There's nothing academic
for pre-K,
for pre-K 3 and pre-K 4,
Yeah,
but
because
I
we
also,
don't
or
have
kindergarten or 1 or 2.
with that, okay. So that's a point for continued discussion, but I want to move on so that Marcus can ask some questions and that other board members can ask questions.
Well, I just had one quick question. Was there a broader discussion about, how we may quantify how schools meet some of the non-academic needs that students and families have that contribute to their academic success? Was there kind of a broader conversation around it?
I think so. Can you say more about what you mean?
Well, it's kind of difficult to describe in my mind too, but I thought maybe it had been a discussion at the table previously, just about, in a lot of communities, students walk in with varying issues that can, in theory, be met inside the school and probably for the betterment of the student should be. Have we thought about ways to quantify that so that we can create metrics around those non-academic needs?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think, let me try and answer and see if this gets at it. I definitely think that is one of the big areas of discussion, and it has been one of the big parts of the board's feedback as well around sort of how to best capture that. Part of where we have thought about that in this proposal is around that we believe some of the attendance metrics and the re-enrollment metric, although they sound technical, are outcome measures in some way of the environment that a school is creating and how welcoming it is for parents and for students. So when we look at, for example, there were both research and focus groups that the truancy task force recently did around why students aren't coming to school, right? Why are students not coming to school? Often it is because, yes, sometimes it is, outside barriers like transportation or other needs like that, but also it is sometimes because they're not feeling engaged, right? They're not interested in their coursework and so they're not coming. And so those measures actually show the extent to which schools are creating that environment and wanting students to come. And we've seen that some of the research shows that schools can have a significant influence on this. And so, for example, while schools with higher poverty generally do struggle more with attendance, it's not direct correlation, right? And you can see schools that have high poverty that also can make tremendous success in improving their 90% plus attendance rates by creating a more welcoming and engaging environment. That said, I can't pretend that is the viewpoint that sort of we put forward at this point. I will also say that class is really, it's not a student assessment, it's a measure of student-teacher interactions, and that also is a measure of sort of the environment in pre-K classrooms. That has been sort of our thought, in addition to then those environmental factors in this, but again, I think the board has certain members of the board have expressed additional views on sort of other ways we could capture that. So I think that is a broader discussion that will keep going. But in addition to the accountability system itself, there's also the public reporting aspect. So there are things you might not include points in the accountability system, but would still talk about and report publicly and make available for all schools. So one of the big things that DC has done in recent years is create these equity reports that are available for public consumption. It's been a partnership between the DME's office, OSSE, the Public Charter School Board, reports, for example, report on suspensions and expulsions disaggregated by data, which is report on mid-year exits from the school, and additional rates like that, and it disaggregates those by types of students. So I think those are additional metrics, and I think that kind of public reporting is something we're really committed to continue.
And it's actually weird because I was going to ask you about suspensions are probably factored into the NC attendance metric.
Yes, I can't tell you exactly how often, but yes,
Okay.
and it's, yeah.
And then mid-year exits are probably factored into the re-enrollment metric.
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Lynette, and then Laura.
Thank you. I'm just curious, there's been some discussion about the growth measure in high school, that our 8th graders are being tested for 9th grade and 10th grade, and that puts 3 grades, 3 classes together. Children are leaving 8th grade, and that score is going with them to an LEA or public school. Could that not be some way to measure growth? Because we have 3 grades, and that may have, significant difference on the high school, and the high school, for high school, for parents as well, and for our communities to know growth is actually existing in that particular school.
Yeah, so previously what we did was, before Park, when we had DC CAS, students took the 8th grade DC CAS, and then in high school they took 10th grade DC CAS. And that was, so all kids were taking the same assessments at the same time. And so we had a high school MGP that was calculated similar to K-8 MGP, based on the 8th grade to 10th grade jump. We've never actually had required 9th grade testing in DC, or at least not in the recent memory. And so with Park, the difference is, instead of it being a grade-based assessment that everybody takes in 10th grade, it's actually a course-based assessment. So in math, it's an Algebra 1 test, Geometry test, or Algebra 2 test. And the test we've picked in DC as the required assessment is the Geometry test. So you take the Geometry test whenever you are enrolled in that course. So many students take it in 10th grade. The most common course pattern is students take 8th grade math in 8th grade, Algebra 1 in 9th grade, and Geometry in 10th grade. And so those students would take the 8th grade math test in 8th grade, and they would take the Geometry test in 10th grade. And to your point, next year, for the first time, we will be able to calculate an MGP based on that group of students. But that's not all students, it's only a subset of students. And next year's the first time we'll have that because it's the 3rd year Park testing. But because it doesn't capture all students, the question is that the growth measure we should use, or is there some other type of growth measure we can develop that sort of better gets at it? And that's part of what we're still exploring.
Laura?
Thanks. Could you very quickly tell me, does economically disadvantaged, what's the definition? I think I've looked on the website a million times, I can't find it.
Yeah, so right now in DC, it's still free and reduced price lunch. And so it's, the schools that have community eligibility, it's up to 1%. I will say there's some weird tweaks around Henry reports and how it's defined there, where this was really, I don't know, but Sean can tell you more about afterwards.
Will you continue to use that?
I think that is a big question. So, yeah, you guys know that.
And I just deeply encourage that we stop doing that. It's so meaningless.
Yeah, we are considering it, and so I'll just give you like a tiny glimpse into the complexity of this. It's something we're actively exploring. Other states, most states use either free and reduced price lunch or the community eligibility tables, or they use direct cert, which is basically SNAP and TANF only. The problem with SNAP and TANF only is the only way to get that data is based on the people who actually receive those benefits, which undercounts undocumented populations, which would be eligible for those benefits but don't actually receive them because they are less likely to come forward.
Repeat that again.
And so there are some states that
Council, could you repeat that one more time? Mark didn't hear. You were talking about undocumented workers being
Yeah, so-
underrepresented with that system.
That's right. So if you're a low-income family that is undocumented, what we've heard anecdotally from schools is that those families may be eligible for the benefits because their income threshold, they're below the income threshold, but they may not actually receive the benefits because they're reluctant to get sort of recorded with the government in that way, right? And so there's a concern that just going to automatically to direct cert could undercount undocumented students who are a key population and are low income. The problem is we don't have another good proxy for low income. So some states have started to explore some creative ways around that to try and get at that issue, and we're looking at some of those options. But that's why it's not as easy as just flipping a switch.
If I remember correctly, the language access access survey, or the home language survey requires free Florida income.
I'm not sure.
So I filled it out multiple years, and for some reason I remember checking off income, but I might just misremember. Okay. So that might be a way to actually gather it, depending on how schools put it into the database.
Or should there be a direct cert plus X% or something like
Yeah,
that?
based on
To
like census
sort of
data.
estimate what the uncaptured population might be. Let's just think about it and be creative without violating federal laws.
No, that's right. So like one state we've started to look at basically looks at direct cert or free and reduced price lunch minus community eligibility, and so it gives schools the option of collecting the free and reduced price lunch forms if that would give them what they believe is a more accurate count. So we're looking at that.
Great. I want to make sure I understood the whole calculation thing with the 5%. If the Latino example that you gave, they're still counted in the all, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And then, are you not doubling, triple counting families?
Yeah, this has been
So if you're African American and economically disadvantaged and special ed, you're counted at 15%.
That's correct. Sorry, not 15.
5%, 5%.
You're included in each of those buckets. So basically, the idea here is, so if you had a school that was, let's just say, use this population. So let's just say 100% of your students are Black, economically disadvantaged, and they have IEPs. In that case, the all students framework and each of the subgroup frameworks would be exactly the same. So in that sense, yes, it is quote unquote double counting in that people are included in multiple groups. The reason for doing it this way is again to call out specifically, so all students group will always capture all students, but the idea is to look specifically, so let's say you have a very small special education population, it's only 2% of your school, let's say, but we believe that the needs of those students are important, and we know as a city that is failing miserably, right? And so we want to call that out separately and count that as 10% of your score, because otherwise they will only be this tiny fraction of your overall score and they might never get the attention. So it's both calling it out in terms of being able to see that final number and be able to compare. And so then again, also if you wanted to compare just the performance of students with special needs at the school of 2% of students with IEPs versus the school that has 90% of students with IEPs, it would be very hard because it would be weighted differently in the all students group. But you could look at just the SPED framework within those two schools and compare side by side.
So I thought we already did this in the past accountability framework. So I remember one particular school in my ward that was rising got bumped to focus because their special education population had 0% proficiency. So we are already reporting that out, and as I understood the applicability of accountability in that case, it was if any of your subgroups are not performing at X level, you're bumped to focus. So tell me how this is different.
Yeah, there's a couple of different things there. So you're right that we've reported out the data in a disaggregated way since No Child Left Behind. That was one of the big things that law did. And then with the waivers and the focus designation, Ed said you have to identify your lowest performing schools with priority and then the schools with low performing subgroups as focus. That type of designation still exists in this law. We have not paid as much attention to this, but the law requires identifying certain schools for comprehensive support, which is similar to the priority category, the bottom 5% of schools. And then also it requires identifying some schools for targeted support, and that includes schools that have low subgroups. The difference here is in the past, the priority and focus labels were both basically diagnosing a problem and it was the overall label for the school at the same time. So if you would have otherwise been a reward school, but you had low school framework, you were automatically counting as focus. Same with a school that might have had really different types of performance, but also had a low performance school. What we are thinking about now is, again, this gets to sort of that final stage of what are the final ratings, how many groups and so on that we haven't presented on today. Part of what we're thinking about is actually, could you actually separate the rating from the identification of low performance? And then also like a school might be, let's say we're using a star system, 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. You might be a 4-star school, but you're identified for targeted support because one of your schools was particularly low performing, and then we work with you to improve that, the performance of that school. So sort of separating out improvement designations from overall designations is one way of thinking about it. Another difference is that in the past, let's say you were performing well as a school, you had a subgroup that wasn't doing quite as well, but they weren't so low as to make you focus, that wouldn't have been called out in a different way, right? And here it is, that it's reported separately, and it would affect your score no matter what. Even if it didn't put you in that bottom category, it affects your score. And similarly, actually, it can also affect your score positively, which is one of the other differences. So there are some charter LAs that have come to me, or DCPS schools that have come to me and said, we are doubling down in a really serious way on special education that is different from what our peers are doing. We're not getting any credit for it, right? Like, and this system would be a way that actually, as those schools are doing better, then they might actually, their overall score could improve if they're doing much better at serving students in special education.
I'm sure you've talked with more people about this. I'm not sure it will incentivize what you're thinking about. Just based on this tiny example, that made that school double down on special education because their status dropped. And so I almost wonder if this if there's a score and then these designations that you're talking about, whether it's like excellence in serving kids with special needs, like there's an excellence designation and I don't know, versus, because I just don't know, it just gets all muddled up in the score because it becomes so technically challenging to follow that parents are going to understand what's in there. Like even after sitting here thinking and reviewing your presentation in advance, I would still have a hard time explaining it. And if we're trying to meet all of the principles we talked about in the beginning of having one system that's really understandable, I just wonder if we're overcomplicating versus just setting the bar and giving designations.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think like simplicity versus sort of holisticness is like one of the big tensions in an accountability system design, right? Yeah. The simplest accountability system is you take the percent of school students who are scoring at 4+, you just use that, right? Whereas the NCLB system of like, you just use that and you count that for everything, right? But that is missing all kinds of nuance for all kinds of reasons, but that tension is one that we feel distinctly. Right. I will say that in terms of your idea around calling out schools for excellence, that is definitely one of the things we're thinking about in the state plan, that we hope to call out this idea of sort of recognizing people and building that into the system as well, both in terms of overall designations, but also other types of recognitions.
Well, I think this goes to part of our, actually, something that's later down the list, which is our committees. We're talking about graduation requirements, and we talked about a diploma of distinction or a diploma with a certification. Perhaps schools could have a certification if they're really good at special ed, or if they're really good at economically disadvantaged, or if they're really good at English language learners. I don't want to throw something into the mix that's totally off the wall, but maybe if there are special schools that are really good at certain subgroups, they could get some special certification or recognition or designation in some manner that would call attention to what you just said.
Well, in a way that might be
that's understandable to parents.
And I know I have a lot of questions here, but the last is I want to talk a little bit about enrollment and attendance. So I wonder if, and again, I understand you're simplifying and you don't want to push more data burden onto schools. I wonder if this is an opportunity to have somebody conducting exit interviews for why parents change schools, because I think there are two categories, right? Like controllable and outside of locus of control re-enrollment considerations. And so, if we really want to understand why parents are moving, this is a huge opportunity. If we don't want to penalize schools that have lots of families moving out of state because the housing stock, so Ward 1's housing stock is not family friendly, right? So you're going to see mobility that's somewhat uncontrolled just because we only have 2-bedroom condos in most of the area that are affordable. Even. So I don't know. I just put that in there.
I got a lot of 1-bedroom condos.
Yeah, right. There's development. We're not creating 3-bedroom and up housing facilities in some of the more densely populated wards.
So 2 parts to that answer. I think one thing is the re-enrollment calculation does account for some of those factors. I can't promise that it's perfect, but yeah, I think if you move out of state, it doesn't count that student against you, for example. So it's not perfect, but it does account for some of that.
Okay.
But what about
it's way more controlled than a flat.
Okay. In the future, you'll show us how all that stuff, all those details.
Yeah, I think we're trying to balance sort of like how technical to get, but knowing that that's something you're interested in, absolutely, we'll show that to you all. The second piece, though, is to your point about interviewing parents. Actually, this has been a huge focus of discussion in the cross-sector collaboration task force. We've been talking a lot about mobility issues, and Karen obviously serves on it. And there's a series of upcoming community engagement meetings to share those discussions with the public. But one of the big proposals is actually sort of expanding the scope of My School DC team to look at mid-year mobility as well, and to sort of like
so, I know all of the data associated with attendance and why it's weighted so heavily here. At the same time, we do know that attendance doesn't equal actual instruction or learning. And given that we just pushed these CBE regulations forward, I see that you designated the availability of sort of enhanced academic offerings through IB and AP, but can't you also include CBE? Like, is this a school that's doing CBE as a way to encourage more schools, especially because we have so little on the growth phase for high school, as a way to encourage personalized learning and really targeted competency-based instruction?
I am not sure.
I don't know what that would exactly look like, but I just...
Yeah, I think that's where I was going, the sort of understanding what the outcome would be of the competency-based course, right? So, because the AP and IB framework is around encouraging, yes, participation, but also balancing that with performance there. Right. So thinking about sort of what that would look like in a competency-based world, but happy to talk more about what that sort of looks like. I will just say in terms of like the weight on enrollment and re-enrollment and attendance metrics, I think sort of, if we're not, there's a universe, right? And so it's, we're balancing sort of like the weight to put on test-based measures and then other measures.
We're getting really short on time here, but I think this is a really important discussion. I'm wondering how much of it might be able to move to the S committee meeting for a full list of questions. But I know Joe has a question or two. Ashley hasn't asked anything, and I'd like Ruth to, or Karen hasn't either. And then I'd like Ruth to close, hopefully in the next 10 minutes if we can. So Joe?
So most of my questions, all of my questions were really answered, but I do want to make a point. When we talk about the accountability principles, completely agree. But I also think, at least from a board perspective, at least from my perspective, we want to be able to identify schools that are closing the achievement gap, that are raising academic success of our students. And I think we need to make sure what you're talking about a little bit with the rewards, ribbons, gold stars for different schools that are accomplishing those goals would be a positive step in that direction. So I just want to flag that and make sure that you know you're supported in that. But I think there's also something around making sure that we're able to identify where schools are failing and target interventions. So the transparency of data and making sure that we're pulling out or able to pull out the data around subgroups or across the different sectors, across the different groups is critical to how we move forward and make sure that this is useful for us as policymakers and more importantly gets resources to the kids who need it. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, no, well appreciated. I was just going to say, sorry to jump in the middle, but to your point, in trying to, believe it or not, we carried this down a little bit from the original version. Among some of the heads we cover, actually, I think our broadest vision, even before those specific accountability design principles, is that we want to continue the progress we're making for all students, and we want to ensure faster progress for the students who are furthest behind and closing those gaps. And I think at the broadest level, that is our vision and what we are, the guiding force by which we're trying to design the system. And to your second point, part of that, really being able to call out the places where people are struggling, is part of this framework around our instruction proposal around accountability specifically.
And I just also wanted to push back just a little bit on the youths, on the emphasis beyond growth. You mentioned you looked at what other states are doing. We're very unique compared to other states. We're not Iowa. We're an urban school district where on NAEP, 3 out of 4 kids are not reading proficiently in 4th grade. We are very unique. So looking at other states, they can be instructive, but it shouldn't be limiting to what we can do.
I understand.
Ashley, did you have anything at this time?
No further questions.
Then if nothing else, I'd like Ruth to close out with some comments, and then I'd like to work with your team because I thought this was really important, and whether it's you or Jesse or someone else, I think having this discussion with all board members again or a longer version of it would be very instructive for all of us. We could prepare some questions in advance. The committee could, but we could find some way to accomplish that where we can continue to have a public dialogue that helps board members and the public become a little more informed within the next, 4 to 6 weeks. Ruth?
Let me just throw out one very different question, which we haven't talked, actually two very different questions that we haven't talked about, and we give short answers or we can put them off. One is, under No Child Left Behind, there was also rating of the LEAs. And we've only been talking about the rating of the schools. And is there also an evaluation of the LEAs as there was under NCLP?
That's not something we've thought about at this time.
So we don't have to put that into the,
That's correct.
it's definitely optional?
Yeah, we would still report out on LEA level results, but not do designation.
Okay. And then the second thing, you've gotten some correspondence, as have many of us, about this question about the goals. And I'm curious, what is your understanding of the law and what is your proposal in terms of, will there be specific goals that different groups of kids are supposed to meet, and would they be different for different kids? And if so, when would we see that?
Yeah, so part of the state plan template that Ed is requiring every state to complete and submit does include setting goals. You need to set both long-term and interim goals. It only gets specified specific years that you can decide, but long-term might be 10 years or 20 years out, and then interim would be annual goals leading up to that. I think that we are still thinking about sort of what the goal-setting framework should be, and if there's any connection to the accountability framework as well. It definitely would become public as part of the state plan by the end of January. Think about if there's some way to share things sooner. I think the challenge is that the reality of where our current students are, as you all know, is that there are incredibly significant gaps. So if we were to set a goal next year that 80% of all students score at the 4+ level on PARCC, which is one of the areas where we have to set goals, our white students are quite close to that bar, so that goal might be reasonable. Our students in special education are at 4%, 5%, 6% right now. That is insane. It's just not mathematically possible to get to the 80% bar tomorrow. Does that mean we don't have the same expectations for those students? I think we are deeply committed. We believe that every student can succeed, and we're deeply committed to getting there, but we're also realistic about sort of what is possible in the short term. And so between the short-term goal and the long-term goal is where we're trying to balance this. No Child Left Behind, the approach to this was just to try and say 100% of students would be proficient, and they thought they were setting the bar far enough in the future that it would be fine, right? And then as we got closer and closer to that date that they set, every school in the country started being on the path to failing, which is why Ed opened up the waiver process to try and allow students to design systems that were more realistic and goals that were more feasible. So I think the challenge is we could not, as an interim goal, set the exact same numerical goal for all students. That doesn't mean that we don't have the same.
Mike, can I just ask, are we required by the federal law to have those goals in our accountability plan, or are you saying they can be separate from
They
the
can be separate.
I'm just going to throw out, it's super complicated, and we already have a bunch of super complicated things, and as we all know from this correspondence, this is not only super complicated, but very difficult to deal with. So I would highly encourage you not to put it in the accountability piece at this point. And with that, I just want to say, we are very eager to work with you, but I feel it's hard to move down, it's hard to push the ball down the field when we're not in greater communication and getting responses to specific things. So I think that this is a very good idea to have more of these with all of us. We'll get you some questions.
I just want to say that it's a little bit hard for me to hear that, Ruth, honestly, because we are also incredibly eager to work with you all, and we feel like we have been working deeply with the board and with a range of other stakeholders in the district. So I think while I feel like we have been engaging not only at every working session and every public meeting, but having a number of conversations, certainly with you and with other individual board members.
It's not about not having the conversations, it's about feeling the responsiveness, and I hear you that you feel like you're having it, and so now you're hearing it, that I think some of us don't feel like there's movement, so that's what we have to get to a place where we can problem solve. That's really what I want, is get to a place where we understand what the differences are and figure out ways to solve them, because I think a lot of these, there are ways to solve it, and they don't have to be super complicated. Maybe, I figured we'd be at that point now, maybe that's someone we can try to do in the committee and try to give some specific kinds of proposals to close the gap.
And so, yes, and I guess the thing I would say is that responsiveness to me does not mean that, I would hope that responsiveness is not just measured by having made a specific change, because I think we've been trying to be responsive to every single question we've gotten, but that doesn't mean we always agree or have come to agreement.
close the discussion by thanking Ruth for the tremendous amount of work that you put into this and that the committee has put into this. You take your role very seriously, and it shows, and I want to just publicly thank you. I'll do it again at our session in 2 weeks. I don't agree with everything, but I agree that we're working towards a better end result and a better product to service all kids. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you've done. And I also want to thank Consul, you and your team. And again, we're not always in agreement. And certainly, I think there will still be movement on this from both sides. But thank you for spending time with us tonight and other nights. And I really would like to do this again with the full board, even if it's with your chief of staff, where we can spend a full 2 hours going through. I mean, if you said to cut things out of this presentation because they're too technical, let's talk those through, and understanding the rationale behind the decisions that were made is really helpful for us, because we come with our anecdotes and we come with what we've experienced in the schools and our boards and citywide, and we have a different perspective because of what we hear. And when we understand the rationale behind the decision-making process, that is incredibly helpful for us and for families and students that we represent.
No, I really appreciate that, and certainly we will find the time to come back and talk with you all. And I just will say that I think if there's one thing I hope you all hear, it is that we are trying to be extremely thoughtful about the decisions we are making and root them in principles, and base it on feedback we are hearing, certainly from you all as well as from other stakeholders. And just one thing I would mention again is I didn't do a great job of summarizing this in the last public meeting, but in that slide deck that we sent, there's the link to OSSE.dc.gov/ESSA, and we have on there summaries of every single meeting we've held. We have notes, we include sort of which people, the organizations that were part of those discussions, and a summary of literally every single discussion. So, for example, there's a session just on English learners and all the pieces related to them. So certainly encourage you all to go and take a look. We've also uploaded every PowerPoint we've used. There's a wealth of things. But we will absolutely find time for that.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to move on to administrative items, if the board's okay with that. And when I'm looking at our agenda, we can actually table the censure issue. We committed to Ruth that we'd work on resolving that in our bylaws and paring it back a little bit with the holidays and with the importance of this ESSA conversation. That has slipped a little bit. We will just bump that 1 month. But we will continue to work on that, and I think John Paul's going to work with you on.
Yeah, we're trying to get some samples from NASB. So.
Terrific. So John Paul, why don't you start with mission statement, and then we'll go to leadership committees.
So in our last working session, we discussed for a couple of minutes the proposed change to our mission statement to reflect a little bit more about what it felt like the strategic plan was talking about, meaning the focus on promoting equity and achievement in DC Public Schools. And so I wanted to bring it back now for discussion because it was not ripe at that time to discuss. And so, but in the interest of time, this is another item that we can push if we need to, if there's agreement to this new mission statement or a plan to move forward with additional discussion about it, we could do that as well. But I wanted to get the sense of the board on where we are with the potential of switching our mission and vision statement to a single mission statement.
I'd suggest that we take a look at it. We've got 3 brand new board members. Lynette, you had a comment on it that I think was incorporated, but I'm not positive. But I'd like us to table this because we've also got it talk in executive session for a little bit of time later today. Are board members comfortable with that? You've got it in your hand now. We can look at it and we can come back in a month and hopefully come to some sort of agreement. Or if we have to have a special discussion on this, we can do that too. But it's our old mission and vision are before you, as well as what John Paul is proposing as a more simplified mission statement.
Did I get
I just wanted to
add one word to it. I thought that, as we read it, we understand achievement is where direction you want to go, but academic, the word academic is very important because you could achieve it and still, you could achieve it jump roping, but that doesn't necessarily mean academically you can read and do math. So I think that one word is a very important word, that in front of achievement, we put academic.
Great.
I will edit this document and send it out again, so you guys have it with that word added.
Great. With that, I'll turn over to Karen. Talk about leadership. No?
No.
Okay.
I would actually swap that, put academic achievement first and
Yeah.
equity.
Okay.
And there's no objection.
Okay.
I have a simple one, but I was just gonna hand it over.
Okay, yeah.
Take time.
That's great. This is a time to be very candid about anyone who is interested in, and I think we can combine these into being in leadership, either as president or as vice president, or leading a committee, a specific committee. I'm not interested in being president for another year. I think I've accomplished a lot in the last 2 years. I've had a lot of fun, but it's been a lot of work. I'm really looking forward to taking a little breath. So I really appreciate the opportunity to serve, and I've enjoyed the work. It has been demanding, much more so, Mark, than you ever told me it would be. But I'm not going to be running for president again, unless I'm absolutely forced to, which I don't think is the case. So with that, anyone who's interested in serving in leadership or heading a committee, please be very frank about your interest, because this is the time to do it.
You want me to say?
Yeah.
Well, in discussions with Jack, and because of the complexity of the issues over the last couple of years, and only because I have some idea, not all of it, of what's happening, I will reluctantly, but will step up and do my best to, if you all think it's okay to be president for at least the next. Like, unless you want to run.
No, I don't, but I don't want you to go in reluctant.
No.
I want you to just say you can do it.
It's okay. This to clarify. This leadership has been much more than either of us anticipated. But my dedication, you can know I'm dedicated because I gave up my job, my paying job, to do this. So I will continue in this role if you so have. So then we need a vice president.
So for me personally, it all comes down to how the duties are divided. So I know the two of you divided president as being more of the policy oriented and vice president as being operationally oriented. And I would potentially be interested in vice president, but not for an operational position. So I don't know if that means we think creatively about how responsibilities are distributed. If we think differently, in fact, about even all of the stuff where you guys were representing the board and whether that gets distributed differently. So I'll just share that and see if anyone has thoughts or comments, or if other people are interested in the traditional way we were organized.
I have a thought, which is actually when we were looking at the bylaws on the dais, we went through them so quickly between the one working meeting and then on the dais. Maybe there was another one that I already forget. But one thing that did strike me on the dais was how lopsided that was. And it did occur to me, apart from Laura even saying this, that division of responsibility between the president and the vice president, I don't think that's a healthy way to do an organization. So I am sort of interested in looking at it structurally through the bylaws. So it may or may not be that we want to do that at this moment in the context of that, or that there can be something informal that goes on and then we reflect it in the bylaws. But I do think it's a problem.
One thing to remember is the new bylaws did create a standing committee which the vice president will chair. So there are
Vice president or the vice president's
or
designee.
designee shall serve as chair. Right. So there are additional structural things that the vice president would be or designee would be responsible for that were not present in the previous bylaw. So just while we're
Does that mean it's more? Does that mean you're saying there are more responsibilities than previously?
well, there's
Yeah.
certainly a committee chairmanship.
And I would just suggest that we actually each individually take some time over the next week, because I'd like to get this figured out by next Wednesday, one way or another. We can also create committees or designate the committees differently, which is why I think we should have that committee discussion as well. I would certainly like the ESSA committee to continue with Ruth as chair. I think it's important, and even after the accountability plan is done, I think having an ESSA committee to talk about what I discussed in terms of follow-up and how those pieces in the parking lot continue to be focused on, I think that is a committee that should not just exist until we stamp the plan. That's what we did when we did No Child Left Behind, is that group existed just until we had our vote, and then it sort of went away. I don't think we can do that anymore. I think that's an abdication of our duties. So I think that we have to think about that. If we have, I said this 2 years ago, and maybe it's more right now, but we could have a vice president for policy and a vice president for administration, which I think maybe that governance committee is part of that. I think we can be really creative about how we organize ourselves and how we can divide the labor a little bit so that Karen's not overwhelmed either.
Well, Ruth, you actually proposed the establishment of the governance committee to do the personnel and the budget work. We could possibly break those two areas out into two different people, possibly. I'm just throwing out.
And you're looking at me.
Oh, well, actually, I was looking at Laura for that part. Because she has expressed an interest in doing that part. But there might be some other ways we could break down the responsibilities other than just into personnel and budget. And John Paul, do you have any suggestions?
No, I mean, I think one of the structural problems that we had in the past is the fact that only two board members, the president and the vice president, were responsible for a significant amount of things. And so if we can find a way to broaden the brush so that all board members have a little bit of ownership in the administration and the budget and the activities and policies of the board, I think that would be incredibly helpful for everybody.
Yes, I agree, but at this point, what kind of things we need to cover that we're not covering would be a better way to approach it.
Well, I think if you look in the bylaws that we just adopted, there was a very lengthy list of responsibilities for the president. So one thing is to look at that list and divide it up in a different way. And I'm sure Jack and Mark, having been in the position, could be helpful in sort of thinking about which ones really need to stick together and which ones could break off.
Yeah, and I could be wrong, but I think the bylaws say president or designee. Or it could be, and we can certainly do that. To Laura, to piggyback on Laura, I'm not interested in being president, but I would be interested in serving in a leadership role, whether that's vice president or heading a governance committee or something. I would be happy to continue in a leadership role in terms of ensuring that there's some consistency and providing my experience to serve the board in the future. So I'm happy to do that as well, and I'd love to talk to anyone else who's interested in seeing how that could work.
Yeah, just an life experience. I have gotten from life experience that we always need to have backup people who are behind us, learning the role, so that when we're ready to step down, there's somebody who has the institutional knowledge to step up. And that's a mistake I've made in other organizations, and I don't want to make it here. So as many people as we can get involved in this process, as many people who can help assist us become we still have internal growth problems that we need to address. So as many people who get involved, I think we're willing to have them, even if it's in this one area, and then,
And John Paul, could you run down the committee list that you think might be appropriate?
Sure.
This is back of the envelope, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
In addition to ESSA, do we need to have a committee for the physical education standards?
So I would recommend we have standing committees like,
Standard.
like a standards or a policy, like, and
Right.
governance and communications and public engagement. You know, something so that when tasks come up, they're designated to that committee, right? So like all of the follow-up, for example, from CBE, if Ruth was leading a policy-oriented, it's policy and accountability or something like that, like the follow-up from CBE goes to her committee and she sort of puts it on her list. Even though you might have these breakout working groups that perform specific tasks related to the interests of members, there's still structure for the follow-through that you guys are talking about. And that's also a way for newer members to really build a depth of understanding without it being in such a public way of what's going on, and ask every question that you have.
Is there, I mean, if there's sort of an agreement or that is a good way for us to go, I can put some thoughts together and send it back out for discussion.
I think it's a good one. I mean, I think
Okay, I will do that then.
it makes sense.
The only one then that does need to be sort of discussed in a separate way is the truancy task force. Camille was our representative on the policy and data committees for that. And so if someone is interested in taking that role, it is open and available. So you discussed that as well.
I would add, I think that's something we can talk about over the next couple of weeks, but I would love to see a comprehensive list of all the city agencies, task force, committees that the board has a seat at the table, and look at those a little bit more comprehensively. It shouldn't all fall to the two people, the president and VP seats.
Okay.
And I think that's another way to.
I think I did that about 3 months into my tenure as president, and I listed, and I think I was on 4. Washington Area Boards of Education, just because we'd never participated before. I participated in. The president of the board is always on the Truancy Task Force Steering Committee, which is different than being on the Policy Committee and the Data Committee. And then we've got some of our other team members are also on the Truancy Task Force and various committees, and they're down at the other end of the table. Hi, Diana. There's that.
the military.
Oh, the Military Compact Commission, which just makes sure that the rules are in place for and aligned nationally, that our laws in DC are aligned nationally in terms of ensuring that we're being responsive to our military families who are a lot more transient. And those meetings have become less frequent than they were a year and a half ago. I don't even think they happen quarterly anymore, but that's run by the Deputy Mayor's office.
With the new school coming in on the base, will that pick up?
That's what the discussion had mainly centered around, well, had certainly centered around, and you know, some of these, I think it really is important for the president to be at, because like that Military Compact Commission, it's Scott Pearson, it's Jenny Niles, it's the senior people, and I think we should have our senior person at those meetings, because you need to be on equal footing. But we can find other places, like you're on the cross-sector task force. That was something that we worked really closely with the deputy mayor to get her to agree to include us in that. But she was also pretty insistent that it be someone who could add value, because Karen was both east of the river and in part of the leadership team. So we can classify our leadership team differently and to give that opportunity to someone else. But I think those were a couple of factors that factored into her selecting the person to represent the board as well. That was a tough conversation, and a lot of work went into it on both our part and the deputy mayor's part to make it work and be representative, given the constraints of that working group or that task force. I don't think there are really any others. Pardon? Raise DC, you're right, yeah. And that, the deputy mayor attends, the chancellor attends.
And I serve on the community schools advisory panel.
But a board member could?
A board member probably could, and I've already talked with them about the potential of adding an additional SBOE member. They haven't gotten back to me yet.
Well, let's put this, can you put this list together and the committees together and circulate it? And let's all just work on that over the next 6 or 7 days, so that by a week from today, we can have a pretty clear, and feel free to talk among yourselves and text each other and email each other about strong feelings.
And so the standing committees that Laura was suggesting, you're just gonna come up with kind of a
I'll
rough
try.
draft?
Yeah, a rough draft.
Well, at least have a straw man that we can then respond to.
If we can come up with I think we should come up with the first framework and then the specific committees that we don't. Okay, the framework of how we're gonna approach this, but if we don't actually come up with all the committees by, next week, we can still add or subtract. So we don't feel pressure making bad decisions.
I think, well, actually, I know that at the meeting in 2 weeks, we definitely want to reauthorize the ESSA committee, and we definitely want to reauthorize the student advisory committee that our student representatives co-chair. Anything else, it would be good if it were done in 2 weeks, but it could be pushed off a little bit.
I'm not saying for everybody.
Yeah.
Couldn't the ESSA committee kind of be reconfigured into that policy?
Right.
Instead of ESSA.
For the accountability.
Yeah.
Anything more on that part?
I would just strongly encourage our community engagement.
Committee?
Yes, and then the proportion of voices working in there.
The only other administrative piece that I have is related to ESSA. If there is, as proposed, which I'd like to continue, a special meeting in April, March, that has the transcription services for that have a cost associated with it of about $750. I just want to raise that as an administrative item. I think John Paul, I don't think we have to adjust the budget for that, but it's just a point of information for folks. John Paul can adjust the budget without us having another vote on a budget amendment and still absorb that cost. But just know that there is a cost associated with that. Yes, because every meeting has a cost to it, both in terms of cost for a stenographer and for, staff time. So if we just need to be very deliberate about special meetings, because we do have a pretty tight budget, although it's better than it used to be.
So, because it's
Nope, that's not how it works. Good question, though.
Quick, so,
yeah.
so you're gonna draw up this committee structure, and you're also gonna look at the current presidential tasks and sort of think about I'm just gonna say, I guess this is obvious, there's 3 obvious committees that we talked about: communications, outreach, accountability, policy, ESSA, and I put research in there, and personnel, administration, and budget. Those are sort of 3 obvious ones.
And I would do more than that, we're only 9 persons.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly. So I think that's probably the way to do it.
Yep, I agree. So, Joanne, do you want to come down here so we can get the Periscope? If you don't mind.
Sure.
want. Thank you. All right, so I know that you all have been here since 5 o'clock, so I'm going to be very brief, but always happy to talk in further detail if you have questions afterwards or anytime in the future. So Happy New Year, everyone. It's nice to see you. So the first slide, we had about the same. So we had 390 calls that came to our office this year in quarters 1 and 2. So we combined the quarters because we present it to you in our annual report in October, late October. So that's a change from prior years. And then we had 393 calls that came to the office last year. One of the things that I've done is to suspend a lot of outreach because we just can't handle any more calls. And so we are having, in the process of recruiting for an associate ombudsman to come in, and we're expecting someone to come in later this month. So that should help a lot. If we go over to slide 3, we see under top complaints that 25% of our cases in 16-17, which is the current school year, are special education. So that's higher than last year during the same time. And then we see we had school access is also at 25%. And school access usually includes issues like involuntary transfer that only happens in DCPS schools, safety transfers, in-boundary school issues, issues with enrollment, and things like that. So that's how we define school access, and we use a similar definition in our annual report.
You said access is about DCPS?
No, I was just saying some of the issues like involuntary transfers only occur in DCPS schools.
Oh, from
right.
other schools
Because
too.
charters would
So,
have,
okay.
yeah. On slide 4, we listed the complaints by ward. Ward 8 is our highest, and of course Ward 7. We received a number of, let's see, we're looking in blue for 16-17 of cases in Ward 4 as well as Ward 5. If you look at slide 5, you see the breakdown, very similar to last year. This year we had 62% of our cases currently to date come from DCPS, students attending DCPS schools, and 34% for charter schools. Grade level band on slide 6. A lot of our cases have come from elementary schools, and you see almost 60% in quarters 1 and 2 in this particular school year. I'm going to skip the next slide to talk about systemic issues, which is slide 8. So we continue to see a lot of issues around special education. And so in our, the Committee on Education had a special education roundtable on November 16th of 2016, and we did participate in that and presented testimony. In response to our testimony, Scott Pearson contacted us, who's the Executive Director, of course, as you know, of PCSB, and asked for a meeting. One of the issues that he paid particular attention to is that next bullet point, which is at a charter LEA, a kindergarten student exhibited significant behavioral issues. Parent initiated an oral request to evaluate the student to determine whether there was a disability, and the school did not follow through with the requested evaluation, and the school ignored repeated requests throughout the school year and informed the parents later on that their child was in danger of being retained. When in fact, when the student started off early on in the school year, they said, the parent said, well, my child needs some help. And so when Scott and Naomi DeVoe was also part of that meeting, they mentioned that they would like to hear those egregious case examples as much as possible in real time so that they could talk to the LEA and try to correct the behavior. It is a challenging position to occupy because we have to have collaborative relationships with schools in order to get things done. At the same time, we know PCSB has oversight authority. So what we said is we will have quarterly meetings with PCSB. We've talked about it for a long time. They seem very committed to actually doing it starting this year. And so we could talk and share our trends, and they can share their trends. And when there are very egregious examples, then we may include or ask them to intervene. we look at slide number 9, again, special education related. Again, we mentioned oral requests, so we would like to explore the possibility of strengthening the protections in the special education laws regarding oral requests for evaluation. As you may know, in 2014, that's when the oral request was put into law. And I think schools are often confused about what is the oral request, are you actually making a formal request, and do we have to do something about it? And so I think it's something that makes sense for our office as well as other stakeholders to talk about, to see if some changes need to be made, or even if it's some guidance or something that would provide some support to schools. RTI, response to intervention. So one of the things that we would like to explore in research is the impact of RTI on the length of time it takes to conduct an evaluation. So some LEAs require a span of 6 to 8 weeks of observation before determining whether an evaluation can occur. So what happens is you're essentially adding an additional 2 months before you trigger the evaluation process. And so for a lot of families, they feel as though it's pretty clear that their child needs an IEP based on behavioral challenges or falling behind academically. And so what happens is later on we actually find they are eligible for an IEP and they get an IEP, but now they've been delayed by a number of months. And then school placement, where DCPS was an example of this, was unable to provide specialized instruction at a student's neighborhood school. So DCPS, in this particular case example, bused the student across town, and then the student arrives to school late repeatedly. And one of the issues there is that the student in this case had a learning disability and doesn't require seclusion, which would occur if they had autism or something else, a self-contained classroom. And so the question is, can we find a way of delivering services to students at their neighborhood schools, which are much closer to where they live? Do you want to talk about the ESSA slide?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so,
I think you have to come here.
During the...
Yeah, because your Periscope is...
Oh, so okay, on the side.
Yes.
Okay. So, during the...
Thank you.
During the November public meeting, we discussed some recommendations for ESSA for the non-academic indicator. So as we indicated in our annual report for the Ombudsman's Office, many of the students who had multiple suspensions were ones who were the most, lived in the most distressed wards. So that's wards 5, 7, and 8. And ESSA calls for a non-academic indicator in particular to address the needs of students with disabilities who are at risk in any other ways. And so we presented some of our findings per Ruth's request, and some of the recommendations we made include including pursuing students chronically placed out of school suspension, so that not just suspensions at place and time, but students who are suspended multiple times. Percent of schools that are using alternatives to suspension. So in order to both reward schools that are looking for alternatives to suspension, while also encouraging other schools to do the same. Noting the reasons for suspensions and expulsions by its behavior tier. So a lot of schools across the country have moved away from what's called zero tolerance policies, and there are still some zero tolerance policies in some of our schools. And so it would be good to track this so that we can know what percentage of students are being suspended for what can be considered minor infractions such as talking back versus bringing a weapon to school. And finally, chronic truancy and absenteeism rate, so we can track not only what percentage of students are attending at one point in time, but what percentage of our students are missing multiple days of school, and what is the demographic and profile of that student.
Thanks, Khadijah. Engagement efforts, if we go to slide 11, in quarters 1 and 2, we've been invited, I've been invited to participate as a panelist to discuss our ombudsman practice. in the Classical Ombudsman Model, in the ABA Dispute Resolution Conference, and the International Ombudsman Association. And both of those conferences will be held in August of this year. Also recently invited to participate in the DC Superior Court Subcommittee, which is comprised of several stakeholder groups, including judges, parent and education attorneys, DC government agencies, such as CFSA, OSSI, and PCSB, and other entities that provide services to youth involved in child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And then we also participated in EdFest. We saw some of you there. We were in orange long sleeve shirts. If we could just quickly move over to slide 12. We had, as you may know, 3 Harvard Law students that worked for us, or worked on our behalf, I guess, in, last semester. And they're part of the Harvard Negotiation Mediation clinical program, and we asked them to do a program evaluation. So some of the takeaways, and we're actually going to send the report in addition to this copy electronically to you hopefully tonight. I'll send it so you could see it. But some of the takeaways were continuing to raise awareness of the office and the services that we offer to families, continuing to look for opportunities to engage systemically, prioritizing a single message about the role. I think a lot of people have a lot of different ideas about what we do, so making sure that we're all saying the same thing about our role, and engaging in proactive communication with school leaders. One of the challenges that you may be aware of is that school leaders can change all the time, and so once you start developing relationships with a set of school leaders, sometimes you see some change, but we should continue to do that. Looking ahead to Q3, we know that on December 21st, the Council of the District of Columbia voted to approve our legislation, and some of the important amendments include exclusive budget and personnel authority, that the State Board will continue to provide administrative and operational support to both offices, and explicit authority to issue reports and recommendations related to our work without prior approval, as well as legislation or language specifically outlining situations when we can refrain from investigating a complaint. People often bring a lot of different issues to our office, so it's to narrow the focus a little bit in the scope. If we just, the last slide is slide 14, where we talk about sort of moving forward. We are pleased to share that Harvard's going to do a second semester with us, which they don't often do. And they're going to provide or create an alternative dispute resolution system. And then we're also going to use some of the recommendations to develop a strategic plan. We've had sort of an informal one, but a more formal one. As I mentioned earlier, we're in the final stages of hiring our additional assistant ombudsman. And then here are just some examples of the ways that we try to engage on national level, local level, with other stakeholders, and they're provided for you. So, any questions? Oh, Mark.
Well, I'm just going to ask just kind of a general inquiry about Ward 8. I guess across the board in terms of how you've aggregated your top complaints, does that trend pretty much hold in Ward 8 specifically, or are the issues a little different?
That's a good question. So you're saying, like, are the issues in Ward 8 a little different than in other wards?
Well, just in terms of kind of the percentage of the complaints you get specifically.
Yeah, I don't have those specific numbers. I could get those for you, but typically special ed and discipline are some of the top issues that we usually see. Yeah, in Ward 8 specifically.
And we've also seen in Ward 7 and 8 that school climate is a big issue as well. It's almost exclusively in those wards.
Laura?
The oral requests element. Could you share a little bit more about what you found to be the barriers to putting in writing the requests associated with assessment?
That's a good question, and where's Clinton? Do you want to?
Sure,
okay.
yeah. So the main issue with the oral request, you have parents who may not know the language, may not know exactly what to say to make a request formal. So they'll just say, maybe in passing in the hallway, I want to have my son or daughter talk tested. So in that way, the schools are not really responding to that. What they're supposed to do, according to the laws, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to, within 3 days, get back to the parent in writing, stating that an oral request has been made, and so therefore there are further steps that the school is going to take. But the schools aren't taking them seriously, or what they're doing is they're saying, well, your son or daughter is not struggling academically, so therefore there's no need to test. And, we'll just kind of let the story play out, and we won't we won't really honor the request right now because it's not needed.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Just one other question. I never noticed that you did some non-public school work. And are they, so these are private schools? Or like Catholic or independent schools?
So not Catholic, like non-public placements, but they're not typically Catholic or like that's a
Okay,
parochial
so these are
school.
non-public placements for special ed students?
Yes.
Okay, these are
Yes.
specifically for special ed
Right,
students? Okay.
right. So the idea is that if OSSI is funneling money, we can help them, but we
Okay.
wouldn't have jurisdiction.
That's why I was,
over the
that's
other
why I
one.
was questioning. Yeah, okay, that's great. So those are placements for the special ed students outside of the public school system?
That's right, that's right.
So first, I just wanted to, I tried to do this at a previous meeting, but we ran out of time. I want to really thank these guys for sitting down with me and talking about some of these issues in terms of ESSA, and for testifying and bringing people to testify, encouraging someone to testify. And I just want to note that one of your issues is continuing to look for opportunities to engage on systemic policy issues. And I do really think this is a great shot. And I like these ideas, and I also want to just continue the conversation about how the way in which the evaluations of schools themselves work sometimes in leading schools to want to push kids out, because that is something that we've talked about and something that I think you guys can really help us nail down a bit more so that we really have some good evidence insofar as we want to push that. And then on the school climate issue, you raised it, and I see here you talked to New York City. When you talk about school climate, is that specifically the expulsion suspension issue, or are you looking at broader things that we should also be looking at in terms of the ESSA stuff?
So Khadijah actually had that recent conversation with New York City this week. Do you want to share?
Yeah, so I spoke with the New York City Mayor's office, the director of school climate in that office. And my understanding of the way they look at school climate is they're focusing on that chronic absenteeism and the suspension rate. And so they right now they were able to get funding from council to implement
So their city council.
their city council, yes, their city council to implement restorative justice coordinators for schools. What I need to clarify is whether it was one pilot school or multiple schools in Brooklyn, but they were able to secure some funding for that. And what was the other part?
Well, I just wanted to add, one of the things you mentioned to me is that was really interesting. So we have equity reports in DC. So they have something similar, but it's like the top 10 schools that have had high flyer schools.
So what they do is they publish as top 10, and then they'll go to those schools that are top 10 and say, hey, you want some money for restorative practices? And they say yes. And they say, or they'll come to them and say, how do we get off this list?
Right.
So shaming works.
Right, apparently. So you had another
Well,
question.
it's the broader question of climate, and let me just throw this out, and we can talk later, is I think that New York City is one of the places in the country that actually uses the surveys of teachers, students, and parents to judge climate in a way that gets used actually in their accountability plans. So if you can connect us with them, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
It could be a model for us.
Yeah, and what I would say in terms of what's being addressed, there are multiple things that are encapsulated in school climate that we discuss in our annual report, such as includes bullying, includes discipline, and includes general communication. But for the purposes of figuring out what we can actually accomplish, we decided to focus on recommending evaluation around chronic suspension and chronic absenteeism.
In terms of the ESSA.
In terms of the ESSA,
In terms of what to put in
ESSA, yeah, exactly.
I'm done.
Any other questions?
Same questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah.
Sorry.
In reference to school placement where the child was being bused, is this OSSI busing, contractor busing, or are they required to get on public transportation?
So my understanding is OSSI is busing them, but OSSI is responsible for the transportation, but DCPS, for instance, is responsible for the placement of the children in cities, in schools across the city.
Okay.
So that's where sometimes they're being placed in a school that's really far from where they live. Even though they're, if their IP calls for transportation, they'll get, transported over to that school.
If I can touch on that.
Sure.
What happens is every LEA has to have a continuum of services. So, in DCPS they have such a vast array things that they can offer. What they're saying is, in a particular school building, we can't offer it here, so therefore it's offered at another school. So they'll then have a change of placement, IEP meeting, and then switch the transportation to another school.
Follow up. Are you allowed to ask if the families are in any of your areas, whether they're homeless?
So we ask for their address as part of our intake process. They're not required to give their address,
Okay.
but often when they are homeless, that tends to come out during the intake process.
Okay. You're not restricted from.
Not restricted,
Okay.
right?
I wanted to ask where the other, there is a large population of homeschooled children, but it's paid for through these public funds because it's a charter school. Have you received any complaints from them? Because I know they come into a brick board building a couple times a week, and a lot of them have children with special needs.
That's a really good question. I don't think we really have. Typically, people who are going to homeschool their children will call us and say, how do I do it? And so we get them started, but we haven't had that situation. That's interesting, actually. We've been here almost 3 years. So. Good. Yes, I try to keep it brief.
Thank you.
Hi, Happy New Year. So the report that you have in front of you is quarter 1 and 2 for the Office of Student Advocacy. The first slide 2 and 3 are just really for our new board members, so that you can have a little bit of an overview of our office. On slide 4, it goes, or slide 5, excuse me, it goes into quarter 1 breakdown for our request for assistance. There are 56 that we have from quarter 1, and those are calls that came into our line that we spoke to someone who processed the request for assistance, and the different resolutions that came out of that. You can see a breakdown of what we did with a particular family. On slide number 6, it is a breakdown of the different topic areas. So when people call, what are the things that they're calling about? The largest was enrollment and access. And that's primarily because in quarter 1, generally people are either trying to switch school, they decided they didn't like a particular school, they're trying to switch, or they're having other challenges, and so that was a larger section. And then second would be exactly what Johanna said, would be special education. I don't think that's really any surprise. And then the other categories fall from that. On slide number 7, organizational referrals. Last year we tried to do a lot of outreach to just larger organizations or government agencies to let them know about our office, and this is the breakdown of how we've actually gotten people to call online. The largest percentage actually comes from schools, which I think is really great. So if they don't have certain things that they can answer for students or families within their schools, they have been referring them to our office. And then secondly would be the ombudsman and other community organizations. On slide number 8 is the breakdown of just RFAs by sector. So 66% come from DCPS, 20% from DC Public Charter Schools, 4% of the parent calling in about a student. The students are not enrolled, and 2% are either from a non-public or the sector is not shared. On slide number 10, this is the breakdown of requests for assistance for quarter 2. There are 44 to date, not counting, I think we had some today, so it's not counting those. And this is the resolution breakdown as to how we supported the caller. On slide number 11, there's again a breakdown of quarter 2 topics. I think what's interesting is here is the shift. So student safety actually went up quite a bit, and so there were more calls about not just safety issues to and from school, but parents also finding that their child was unsafe within school buildings and looking for additional supports for that. Special education and still enrollment and access. And then on slide number 12, it's a breakdown of just the organizational referrals from that particular quarter. So most of the referrals are still, well, DCPS Central Office was a large, there's OSSI that shows up here, and then also community organizations and the Ombudsman Office. On slide number 13, there's the RFA breakdown for quarter 2 by sector. So 54% are from DCS, 33% are from public charter schools, and 9% are unenrolled. And some of that goes back to student discipline issues, or either some of the student safety, parents are taking their children out of school, or either 4% being non-public or sector not shared. So slides 14 and going into 15 is a breakdown of the RFAs by ward. For quarter 1, it was quite a large unsure. And so we worked on that actually because many people just don't know what ward they live in. If I asked my neighbors, they wouldn't know we lived in Ward 5, they just know our address or our neighborhood. So what we've done for quarter 2 is to really start asking, what neighborhoods do you live in? What's your address? Because then we can get a better gauge. We initially thought that that would be a barrier, but most people are fine with providing that information.
And that's what neighborhood you live in, or what neighborhood you're going to school in?
So it depends on normally we ask, what neighborhood do you live in? Because we want to calculate it from where they are, but we do also ask, what's the school? So we know the ward as well. But the numbers that you see are based on where they live.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that might not necessarily represent where the problems really are lying.
Yes, but I could also probably tell you what schools, or we could calculate it also based on the school of the issue. But not everyone who calls is calling about an issue with a school. Sometimes they're either asking about how to get started, they're asking questions about other things, so it's not necessarily about an issue with their particular school.
Okay.
On slide number 16, this is just a breakdown from where we were last year this time. So last year we actually calculated our request for assistance starting from June until the end of the calendar year. And so we were at 53 at that time. This year we've been calculating them within the actual school quarter. So starting with August 1st through where we are now in January. And so we've almost doubled the amount of calls that we've received on our line during that time. I don't feel that the request for assistance is the only way that we should interact with families, and so I'll talk a little bit more about our engagement, because they've, for many years, had other places to call, so we can't expect them just to call our particular line. But I think what's relevant about this particular point is that how we calculated last year, we actually added 45 more days to that particular period of time. So I would like us to receive more, but I am happy about how things have progressed along. So in the section on outreach and engagement activities on slide number 18, you can see that the number of different engagement activities or meetings that we've had within the first 2 quarters have been 86, and you can see the breakdown of the types of engagement or stakeholder engagement that we've had. So 38% of those are with government stakeholders or engagement opportunities, as well as after that, 30% are community-based engagement opportunities. On slide number 19, I'm sure Khadijah would have loved for me to have put the number of that we've been in contact with 981 individuals through this outreach. And many of this number really comes about because we've been more proactive in our engagement out in the community with email blasts that we've sent about things that are going on, or different topics that have been going on, or actually going to other community events. And that's been possible with the addition of Dan, and also Khadijah has been instrumental in that as well. So I don't want the numbers for the request for assistance to reflect the only way that we support families, because we do also work with families in communities in other ways. And I think that number reflects that. On slide number 20, this is outreach efforts and things that we've done thus far. I did not put on here that we participate in the EdFest. I should have thought about that. EdFest, but we have also been working on our word-based parent empowerment series, and our last one went really well. In Ward 7, we had over 30 participants, which I thought was great. We have another coming up this Saturday, as well as I've started talking with Marcus and the Ward 8 Education Council, and also Ward 5 about replicating those. So that will happen probably in quarters 3 and going into 4. We have also been working on updating our resource guide with new resources, cleaning up old ones that are no longer relevant, and putting it in a different format so that it can be much more interactive. Right now what we have are PDFs of different things because that's what we could do. When Dan got here, he decided that he wanted to take it on. So it'll be a lot more interactive and people can work with it a lot more. We're also updating more of our online resources as we've been working with parents in Ward 7 and using different tools. We realized that there are some other resources that we wanted to add as well to the site. One is a parent organization toolkit, which we will launch next week after our meeting on Saturday. We also have the Safe Passage toolkit and resources that are up. We've also been working to do a lot more introductory meetings with ward-based organizations and service providers to also let them know that our office can be a resource to different families that they interact with. And lastly, we are working to translate the rest of our materials and also have interpretation opportunities for when we have meetings in wards where we really need that. Some of the ongoing work, I'll let you just read through those things, but some of the things I didn't highlight already. The student discipline policy analysis and advocacy tools, I'm still working with the Council for Court Excellence on those, and also some trainings around that. The behavior support workshop planning and task force work with some of the different stakeholders that you see listed here, DC Special Education Cooperative, the Bazelon Center, DCPS, PCSB, AJE, etc. And part of that is actually some work that the Special Education Cooperative is really interested in, this task force around what should behavior intervention plans look like and how should those things be moving forward in a more restorative approach to how we work with students and not taking so many punitive actions, so that's part of their work. But I think there's a lot that we learned from our special education panel series last year where there are there are educators as well as families who would like to feel that they could actually trust the behavior intervention plans that they have, but they don't know what other resources are out there. So trying to do some workshops around that. And the last thing I think I'll mention on here is the parent leadership training. I'm on the advisory committee for the DC Parent Leadership Training Institute, which will be out of the Multicultural Service Center. And I'm really excited about that because I was trained as a facilitator last year. And it's a phenomenal resource for parents, but it's definitely something that should live in a community-based organization. So I'm excited about that. I'm still participating in the cross-sector task force and the truancy task force. But that would be the last things I'll mention. So if you have any questions.
Any questions?
Real quick, could I get added, or perhaps other board members would like to be added to your email list so we can get those blasts that are coming out? I'm sure there's info that our constituents would find very useful that we could put into our newsletters and other things that help promote your work. And I think along that same thread, I know you've done the ward-based summits and those. My daughter's school, 60% of the kids live in Ward 7 and 8. So being able to forward that information out about those two, while they may be enrolled in a Ward 6 school, parents are often more likely to show up for something like that that's in the evening and it's closer to home.
Right.
So promoting that communication, even if it's outside of the ward, could be helpful.
Yeah.
So however I can help in doing that, I'd be happy to.
Sure, I would love that. And I will say that for the last one, there were some schools that were represented there that were not in Ward 7. And that's because DCPS and PCSB did help us with identifying some of the places where they could send some of the information. But I'd be happy to also send it on. But there are definitely schools that were not just within Ward 7 because our focus, not just Ward 7, school specific, because we know schools go everywhere.
Parents.
Right, parents. So we had a little internal conversation about that with the first session, but then we decided that it'd be better to broaden it the next time, and so I think we got a lot of people. But I'll be happy to still send it on to you. I know it's on Saturday, but I'll still send you the information so that you can still send it to the parents.
Any other questions? Thank you.
So I only have a couple of quick things. The first has to do with the Banana Board Washington Scholarship Fund that the board has, which was not issued last year. I have a draft plan of how we would issue that scholarship this year for you to review, and we can talk about it at the next meeting since the time is late. The second thing to think about is the email that I sent around. Thanks, Ruth, very much for putting together the meeting with Scott Pearson. There are 3 dates that are in your email. If you've not responded to me, please do so we can get that meeting on the calendar as quickly as possible.
And can I just say one thing? We're having a lot of difficulty doing this, so I know a lot of you have already responded once or even twice to a second set, and all those dates ended up falling, not working on the charter board side. And so we're really starting from scratch with this new set of dates.
That's it for me.
Okay. So now, again, thank you, Joy and Faith, and I move that the state board go to executive session pursuant to DC Code 2575/B10. All in favor?
Cut that out. I think we just